Welcome back, my friend. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time, and your help means everything. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching leaves just one like and one comment, we can easily make it happen. Don't forget to subscribe as well. And now, let's get started. My name is Michael Callahan, and I've been a park ranger for over 20 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here in the boundary waters of Minnesota. Wild animals behaving oddly, hikers claiming they saw ghosts, and even the occasional UFO sighting. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that winter. It was the coldest winter I'd ever experienced. The kind that bites through your skin no matter how many layers you wear. The kind where even your breath freezes mid-air, crystallizing into tiny ice particles that fall like microscopic daggers. The snowstorms had been relentless, piling up so high that some cabins were completely buried, their chimneys the only indication they existed at all beneath the pristine white blanket of death. People were scared to go outside, and honestly, I didn't blame them. I was stationed at a remote ranger outpost near the edge of the forest, the last vestige of humanity before the wilderness took over completely. My job was simple: monitor the weather, keep an eye on wildlife, and make sure campers didn't wander too far off the trails. But this winter was different. There weren't any campers. No one dared to venture into the wilderness with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, the kind of cold that freezes your lungs from the inside if you dare to take too deep a breath. I wasn't alone at the outpost. There were 3 other rangers with me. Peterson, a tough-as-nails woman who'd been working here almost as long as I had. Wright, a younger guy fresh out of training who still had that spark of excitement in his eyes that hadn't yet been dulled by years of isolation. And Redfeather, a quiet man from the Ojibwe tribe who knew these woods better than anyone else. We all got along pretty well, but the isolation was starting to get to us. Days felt like weeks and nights. Well, nights were a whole different story. The wind howled like a living thing outside our cabin, rattling the windows and making it impossible to sleep. It wasn't the normal howl of wind whipping through trees. This was different. Sometimes it sounded like words whispered just below the threshold of understanding. Other times it sounded like screams, distant and desperate. All of us pretended not to notice, but I could see it in their eyes. The unease, the growing fear. One night as I sat by the fire trying to warm my hands, watching the flames dance and trying to ignore the knot of dread that had been growing in my stomach for days, Redfeather spoke up. He rarely said much unless he had something important to share. "Have you noticed anything strange?" he asked, his voice low, barely audible above the crackle of the fire and the moaning wind. Peterson raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Redfeather hesitated before answering, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "The animals," he said finally. "They're gone." I frowned. He was right. Usually, even in winter, we'd see tracks in the snow. Deer, foxes, maybe even wolves if we were lucky. The wildlife always found a way to survive, no matter how harsh the winter. But for weeks now, there hadn't been a single sign of life. Not even birds. The forest was dead silent, as if all living things had fled from something we couldn't see. "Maybe they've moved deeper into the forest," Wright suggested, his optimism betraying his inexperience. "Maybe," Redfeather said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. A certainty that spoke of ancient knowledge. He knew something he wasn't telling us. The next morning, Peterson and I decided to take a snowmobile out to check on one of the nearby cabins. It belonged to an elderly couple, the Johanssons, who'd come up here every winter for as long as I could remember. They hadn't checked in for weeks, and we were starting to worry. The journey through the snow-laden forest was eerie. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. No birds called, no animals stirred. Even the wind had died down to an unnatural stillness that pressed against my ears like a physical weight. When we arrived at the Johanssons' cabin, it was eerily silent. The front door was wide open. Snow had piled up on the threshold like no one had been there for days. My stomach churned as we approached, our footsteps crunching in the snow sounding obscenely loud in the quiet. Inside, it was worse. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Chairs knocked over. Food left half-eaten on the table, now frozen solid. A coffee cup tipped on its side, its contents a brown icicle stretching toward the floor. But what really sent chills down my spine was what we found in the bedroom. The windows were completely frosted over from the inside. and there were strange patterns etched into the ice, spirals and symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to move when I looked at them directly, shifting and twisting in ways that made my eyes water and my head throb. On the bed lay 2 sleeping bags zipped up tight, but when we unzipped them, they were empty. No bodies, no blood, just gone. Peterson cursed under her breath and took a step back, her face pale beneath her freckles. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. I didn't have an answer. We searched the area around the cabin but found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind only those strange, hypnotic patterns in the frost. When we got back to the outpost and told Redfeather what we'd seen, his face went pale, his normally stoic expression cracking to reveal raw fear underneath. "It's not safe here," he said quietly, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting to see something watching us from the darkness beyond. "What do you mean?" Wright asked nervously, the excitement in his eyes now replaced with growing dread. Redfeather didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to his bunk and pulled out an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He flipped through it before stopping at a drawing that made my blood run cold. A creature with impossibly long limbs, sharp teeth, and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through you. Even as a simple drawing, it exuded a malevolence that made me want to look away. "The Wendigo," he said softly, his finger tracing the outline of the creature. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow and false even to my own ears. "Come on, Redfeather. That's just an old legend." He looked up at me with eyes full of fear and ancient wisdom. "Legends come from somewhere, Michael, and some things are older than the forests themselves." Outside, the wind picked up again, howling around the cabin with renewed fury. But this time, beneath the howl, I could have sworn I heard something else. A voice, hungry and cold, calling my name. The days after Redfeather showed us that drawing felt heavier somehow. The air seemed colder, the nights darker, stretching endlessly as we huddled around the fire, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. None of us said it out loud, but we were all on edge. Even Wright, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, had gone quiet, his eyes constantly darting to the frosted windows. I tried to convince myself that Redfeather's warning was just superstition. I mean, a Wendigo? A flesh-eating monster that stalks people in the woods. It sounded like something out of a campfire story meant to scare children into staying close to home. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The empty cabin, the strange symbols in the frost, the eerie silence of the forest, it all painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. One night, as I tried to sleep, Redfeather's voice broke the silence. He sat cross-legged on his bunk, the leather-bound book open in his lap. "The Wendigo is born of hunger," he said softly, his voice carrying easily in the quiet cabin. "In the old days, when winters were harsh and food scarce, sometimes people would be driven to do terrible things to survive, eat what should not be eaten." "You mean cannibalism," Peterson said bluntly, her face illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. Redfeather nodded grimly. "The first bite of human flesh transforms them. The more they eat, the less human they become until there's nothing left but hunger, a hunger that can never be satisfied." Wright shuddered visibly. "That's just a story to keep people from, you know." "It's more than that," Redfeather insisted. "The Wendigo is a spirit. It can possess people, make them do things, or it can take physical form, hunting through the forest. Either way, it feeds not just on flesh but on fear." I cleared my throat, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "If, and that's a big if, there really is something out there, why now? Why here?" Redfeather's dark eyes met mine. "This winter is not natural, Michael. Something has awakened it. Or someone has called it." A cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Outside, the wind picked up, screaming around the corners of the cabin like a tortured soul. A few days later, Peterson and I went out again, this time to check on a wildlife monitoring station about 10 miles from our outpost. It was a small shed equipped with cameras and sensors to track animal movements. We hadn't gotten any data from it in weeks, and we figured the equipment might have frozen over, The ride there was uneventful, but as we approached the station, I noticed something strange. The snow around the shed was disturbed, like something had been pacing back and forth in front of it. But there were no footprints, just long, smooth trails in the snow, almost like something had been dragged, or like something with a body too, elongated to be human, had been slithering across the surface. Peterson saw it too. "What do you think made those?" she asked, her breath forming a cloud in front of her face. I shook my head, not wanting to voice the thoughts creeping at the edges of my mind. "Could be wind," I offered lamely. She didn't look convinced. Her hand rested on the pistol at her hip. Standard issue for rangers, though normally only used for emergency signaling or the rare aggressive wildlife. Somehow I doubted bullets would help us now. Inside the shed, things were worse. The cameras had been smashed to pieces, lenses shattered and wiring torn out in a frenzy. The sensors were ripped from their mounts, crushed beyond repair. It looked like someone or something had torn through the place in a rage, destroying everything with methodical savagery. "Animals don't do this," Peterson muttered, picking up a shattered camera. The casing had been crushed as if squeezed by a hand with inhuman strength. I bent down to pick up one of the broken lenses and noticed something strange. It looked like frost, but when I touched it, it felt sticky, almost like sap or resin. It clung to my fingers, unnaturally warm against my skin, and smelled vaguely of copper and rot, like blood left too long in the sun, though there was no sun to be found in this endless winter. "We should head back," I said quickly, wiping my fingers on my pants, my heart hammering in my chest. "This isn't normal." Peterson nodded, her face pale, all skepticism gone from her eyes. As we stepped outside, I swear I heard something, a faint whisper carried by the wind. It sounded like my name. "Michael." The voice was soft, almost tender, but with an undercurrent of hunger that made my skin crawl. I froze in place and turned to Peterson. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. I didn't answer. Instead, I scanned the tree line around us. The forest was still, too still, not even the sound of branches creaking in the wind or snow falling from laden boughs. Just empty, watchful silence. "Let's go," I said firmly, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The ride back to the outpost felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker, every gust of wind louder. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching down like clawed hands ready to snatch us from the snowmobile. More than once I caught glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, tall, thin shapes moving between the trees with unnatural speed. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time we got back, I was practically shaking, my knuckles white from gripping the handlebars so tightly. Redfeather was waiting for us by the fire when we walked in, his dark eyes immediately reading the fear on our faces. "What did you see?" he asked simply. I hesitated before answering, not wanting to give voice to my fears. The station was destroyed, and I heard something. Redfeather's expression hardened. "It's here." "What's here?" Wright asked nervously, looking between us. "The Wendigo," Redfeather said simply, his voice flat and certain. Peterson scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "You can't seriously believe that." Redfeather didn't argue with her. Instead, he pulled out his book again and flipped to another page, a map of the boundary waters marked with red dots in faded ink. "These are places where people have disappeared over the years," he explained. "Always during winters like this, always in groups." I leaned closer to look at the map and felt my stomach drop. One of those red dots was right where we were now, the Ranger outpost. According to the date scribbled beside it, the last disappearance here had been in 1978. An entire group of Rangers vanished without a trace. "That doesn't prove anything," Peterson said stubbornly, but her voice wavered. Redfeather sighed and closed the book.
"You don't have to believe me," he said quietly, "but you should be careful."
It's watching us now, learning our weaknesses, and it's patient. That night, as we sat around the fire trying to keep warm, Wright suddenly spoke up, his young face gaunt in the flickering light. "Do you guys ever feel like we're being watched?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all turned to look at him. I mean it, he continued nervously. Sometimes when I'm outside, it feels like there's someone just behind me. Like if I turned around fast enough, I'd see something. No one answered him right away, but I knew exactly what he meant because I'd felt it too. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck whenever I stepped outside into the snow, the feeling of eyes boring into me from the darkened tree line. The sense that something was always just out of sight waiting. Redfeather finally broke the silence. It's hungry. What do you mean? Wright asked shakily. The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger, Redfeather explained calmly. It feeds on fear and flesh. The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets, and it's been hungry for a very long time. Peterson rolled her eyes but didn't say anything this time. I noticed her hand was trembling slightly as she stoked the fire. As I lay in my bunk that night staring at the frost-covered window above me, I couldn't stop thinking about what Redfeather had said. Was it possible? Could there really be something out there? Something ancient and hungry stalking us through the endless winter? Just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. The whispering voice from earlier, closer now as if speaking directly into my ear. Michael. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent except for the soft breathing of my companions and the crackle of the dying fire. Outside, the wind had stopped completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows like a physical presence, and on the frosted glass, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through. Something was writing, invisible fingers tracing patterns in the ice. The same spirals and symbols we had seen in the Johansson's cabin, appearing one by one before my eyes. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could do was watch as the final symbol formed, a crude stick figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, staring directly at me from the frost. The next morning, I woke feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been restless, filled with shadows moving through the snow and whispers calling my name. I'd seen things in those dreams, long, pale limbs reaching through darkness, antlers silhouetted against a blood-red moon, hollow eyes watching me from between the trees. I couldn't remember all of it, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like the frost on the windows. When I got up and looked around the cabin, I could tell I wasn't the only one feeling it. Wright was sitting by the window, staring out into the forest with a blank expression, dark circles under his eyes. Peterson was pacing back and forth, muttering to herself, her normally confident demeanor frayed at the edges. Even Redfeather looked uneasy, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion. The symbols I'd seen forming on the window the night before were gone, melted away with the morning light. But I knew they had been real as the fear gnawing at my insides. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my work. There was always something to do, checking supplies, monitoring the radio for weather updates, keeping the fire going. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. It hung between us like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Our supplies were running low faster than they should have been. Food that should have lasted weeks was dwindling rapidly. The generator was burning through fuel at twice the normal rate, leaving us with dimmer lights each day. Even the firewood seemed to burn too quickly, turning to ash in minutes rather than hours. Something's wrong with the radio, Peterson announced after her morning check. It's not picking up any signals. Could be the weather, I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Or something's blocking it, Redfeather said quietly, his eyes on the window. Wright let out a nervous laugh. What, you think the Wendigo is jamming our communications? Redfeather didn't smile. It doesn't want us calling for help. The implication hung in the air between us. We were isolated, cut off, alone in the wilderness with something hunting us. Around noon, Wright volunteered to go outside and gather more firewood. He was trying to act normal, to be useful, but I could tell he was nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled on his coat, and his face was pale beneath his beard stubble. I'll be back in a few minutes, he said, forcing a smile as he pulled on his gloves and grabbed the axe leaning by the door. We all stayed quiet as he left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, followed by the crunch of his boots in the snow as he trudged toward the woodpile behind the cabin. Then silence fell again, heavy and oppressive. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 15. Outside, the sun was already beginning its early descent, casting long shadows through the trees. The light took on that peculiar quality unique to winter afternoons. Pale gold but without warmth, illuminating but revealing nothing. "He should be back by now," Peterson said, breaking the silence, her voice tight with worry. "I'll go check on him," I offered, standing up from my chair trying to ignore the dread pooling in my stomach. Redfeather stood up as well. "I'll come with you." We grabbed our coats and stepped outside into the freezing cold. The temperature had dropped even further, the kind of cold that burns your lungs with each breath. The snow crunched under our boots as we walked toward the woodpile behind the cabin, our breath-forming clouds that hung in the still air like ghosts. But when we got there, Wright was nowhere to be seen. The axe was missing from the pile, but no wood had been cut. "No sign of Wright at all, right?" I called out, my voice shaky, sounding small and insignificant in the vast whiteness surrounding us. "Right, no answer. Just the hollow echo of my voice bouncing back from the surrounding trees." Redfeather knelt down and pointed at something in the snow, footprints leading away from the cabin and into the forest. They were deep and uneven, like Wright had been running, or being pursued. "Why would he go into the woods?" I asked aloud, my breath forming crystals in the freezing air. Redfeather didn't answer. He just started following the tracks, motioning for me to come with him. I hesitated, looking back at the cabin, our only shelter, our only safety, then followed, my hand instinctively resting on the pistol at my hip. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The trees around us grew thicker, their bare branches reaching out like claws in the dim light. The forest felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with nature, alive and malevolent, watching our every move. The tracks led us deeper and deeper, becoming more erratic, with places where Wright had clearly fallen, leaving body-shaped depressions in the snow, before scrambling up to continue his desperate flight. The footprints led us to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. The snow in front of us was stained red. At first I thought it was blood, my heart seizing in my chest, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was frost-tinted with a strange reddish hue that shimmered in the light, spreading outward from the center of the clearing like a grotesque flower blooming in the snow. In the center of the clearing stood Wright's axe, buried deep in the ground as if someone had slammed it there with all their strength. But there was no sign of Wright. No body, no blood, no explanation for the axe or the crimson frost or the footprints that led here and then simply stopped. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. Redfeather knelt down again and touched the red frost with his gloved hand. He closed his eyes for a moment, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer, before standing up and turning to me. "It's a warning," he said simply. "A warning from what?" I asked desperately, the cold seeping into my bones and making me shiver uncontrollably. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the edge of the clearing where something caught my eye. A single set of footprints leading away from us. They weren't human footprints, though. They were long and narrow with claw-like impressions at each step, spaced too far apart to have been made by anything I'd ever seen. And they led deeper into the forest, where the shadows gathered thick and impenetrable between the trees. "We need to go back," Redfeather said firmly, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. I didn't argue. My body felt numb, and not just from the cold. Fear had seeped into me, freezing my thoughts, making it hard to process what I was seeing. All I knew was that Wright was gone, and something inhuman had taken him. When we returned to the cabin, Peterson was waiting for us by the fire. Her face lit up when she saw us walk through the door, but when she realized Wright wasn't with us, her expression darkened, fear and anger battling in her eyes. "What happened?" she demanded, rising to her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We found his axe," I said quietly, but no sign of him. I couldn't bring myself to describe the red frost or the inhuman footprints. It was too much, too real. Saying it aloud would make it undeniable. Peterson cursed under her breath and slammed her fist against the table. "This is insane. We need to call for help. The radio's dead," Redfeather reminded her calmly, though the strain showed in the tightness around his eyes. Peterson paced back and forth again like a caged animal, before stopping suddenly and looking at me. "You heard something last night, didn't you? What did it say?" I hesitated before answering, not wanting to admit the truth even to myself. It called my name. She stared at me for a moment before shaking her head angrily. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself. "It can't be real." but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe her own words. She had seen too much now to deny it. The abandoned cabin, the destroyed monitoring station, and now Wright's disappearance. Something was hunting us, something that defied rational explanation. Redfeather sat down by the fire and opened his book again, the ancient leather creaking in the silence of the cabin. "The Wendigo doesn't just hunt its prey," he said softly, his finger tracing the words on the yellowed page. "It makes them lose their minds first, separates them from the group, makes them vulnerable." "Great," Peterson snapped sarcastically. "So now we're all going crazy." "It feeds on fear," Redfeather continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets. And it's patient. It can wait days, weeks before it strikes." I sat down beside him and stared into the flames of the fire, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Wright was gone. Something unnatural had left those clawed footprints in the snow, and now Redfeather was telling us that fear itself was making things worse. I didn't know what to believe anymore, but as night fell and the darkness pressed against the windows once more, I found myself straining to hear that voice again, the voice that called my name with such terrible intimacy. And I found myself wondering if Wright had heard it too, calling him into the forest, luring him to his doom. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin with renewed fury. But beneath it I could hear something else now, a sound like laughter, cold and hungry, echoing through the endless night. That night, none of us slept well. Not even Peterson, who usually prided herself on being tough as nails. Every creak of wood or gust of wind outside made us jump like frightened rabbits. The darkness felt alive, pulsing with malevolent intent. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling above my bunk, afraid that if I looked at the windows I'd see those symbols forming again. Or worse, a pale face with hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. And then just before dawn, when the night was at its darkest and coldest, we heard it, a scream, long and piercing, that echoed through the forest like a dying animal calling out for help. It sounded like Wright's voice, raw with pain and fear, the kind of sound a human being should never make. The scream froze all of us in place. It was unmistakable. Wright's voice, sharp and desperate, cutting through the silence of the early morning. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stared at each other, wide-eyed, as the sound faded into the cold air outside, leaving behind an echo that seemed to reverberate in my skull. "We have to go find him," Peterson said, already grabbing her coat and checking her pistol. "Wait," Redfeather said firmly, stepping between her and the door. "It's not him. What are you talking about?" Peterson snapped, her face flushed with anger and fear. "You heard him. He's out there." Redfeather shook his head slowly, his dark eyes grave. "It's not Wright. It's the Wendigo." I felt my stomach twist at his words because deep down I knew he was right. There had been something wrong about that scream, something hollow and hungry beneath the pain. "How do you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Wendigo mimics voices," Redfeather explained calmly. "It uses them to lure people out into the woods, into the dark." Peterson looked at him like he was crazy, her hand still on the doorknob. "You expect me to believe that?" "Wright is out there, and he needs our help." "Peterson," I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady though my heart was racing. "What if he's right? What if it's a trap?" She glared at me but didn't argue. Instead, she sat down by the fire and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. I couldn't tell if she was crying or trembling with rage. Maybe both. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. None of us wanted to go outside. Not after hearing that scream, but staying inside wasn't much better. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in on us. Every sound outside, the wind, the creaking trees, the occasional thump on the roof, made my skin crawl. By nightfall, the blizzard had picked up again, howling around the cabin with renewed fury. The radio was still dead, and the satellite phone I'd tried to use as a backup gave nothing but static. We were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped with something ancient and hungry circling our shelter. As we sat around the fire trying to keep warm, our faces gaunt in the flickering light, Peterson suddenly spoke up. "What happens if we don't stop it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. Redfeather looked up from his book. "It won't stop." "What do you mean?" I asked nervously, though part of me already knew the answer. "The Wendigo is ancient," he explained, closing his book and setting it aside. "It doesn't just kill people. It spreads its hunger. If it gets strong enough, it can turn others into Wendigos too. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature.
How does it do that?
Redfeather hesitated before answering, his eyes fixed on the flames. Through hunger. It makes you feel a hunger nothing can satisfy. Not food, not warmth, nothing. Until there's only one thing that will feed it. Peterson scoffed. Well, that's comforting. Redfeather ignored her sarcasm and turned to me instead. Michael, you've heard it calling your name. I nodded slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. It's trying to get into your mind, he said quietly, to isolate you, make you vulnerable. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stared into the fire and tried not to think about it. Tried not to hear that voice in my head calling me with such terrible longing. Later that night, as we all tried to sleep or pretended to, I heard something again, this time louder than before. Michael, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice clear as day coming from just outside the cabin door. A voice I recognized with a jolt of horror that sent ice through my veins. It was Wright's voice. I sat up in my bunk and looked around. Peterson was still asleep, or at least had her eyes closed, but Redfeather was awake, sitting by the window with his book in his lap, a troubled expression on his face. You hear it too? I asked softly. He nodded without looking at me. It's getting stronger. What do we do? I whispered, fighting the urge to cover my ears as the voice called again, more insistent this time. Redfeather turned to me with a serious expression. We wait. For what? For it to make its move. The next morning we woke up to find that something had happened during the night. The snow outside was covered in strange patterns. Spirals and symbols etched into the frost like someone had carved them with a knife. They surrounded the cabin in a perfect circle, almost like a barrier. What is this? Peterson asked as we stood outside staring at the markings, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It's marking its territory, Redfeather said grimly. Claiming us. Why does it toying with us? She demanded. Why not just attack? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the tree line where something caught my eye. A single figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by falling snow. At first, I thought it was Wright. But as I squinted through the snowstorm, I realized it wasn't him at all. The figure was tall and thin, unnaturally so, with limbs too long for its body and a head that appeared to be crowned with something like antlers. Its eyes caught the light strangely, glowing faintly in the dim morning light with a bluish phosphorescence that made my heart stutter in my chest. It's here, Redfeather said calmly, though I could hear the fear beneath his stoic tone. What do we do? Peterson asked nervously, her hand going to her pistol, though she must have known it would be useless against what faced us. Redfeather didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a small pouch from his coat and began sprinkling its contents around the cabin, a mixture of herbs and ashes that smelled faintly of smoke and earth, cutting through the crisp winter air with its organic pungency. This will protect us for now, he said quietly, completing the circle and stepping back inside the cabin. For now? I repeated nervously. Redfeather nodded. The Wendigo is patient. It will wait until we're weak, until fear or hunger drives us out. I didn't know what else to say, so I just followed him back inside and locked the door behind us, though I knew locks meant nothing to the thing watching us from the forest. That night was worse than any before it. The wind howled louder than ever, shaking the windows and rattling the walls of the cabin like it was trying to break inside. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the walls, creeping across the wood in those same unsettling patterns we'd seen outside. And then we heard it again. The voice calling out from somewhere in the storm. Michael, Peterson, Redfeather. It knew our names now, all of them. The voices didn't stop. They called out to us all night, growing louder and more desperate with every passing hour. Sometimes it sounded like Wright. Other times it was voices I didn't recognize, perhaps the Johanssons or other victims from years past. But the worst part was when it started sounding like my wife. Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, cancer that took her far too quickly. But hearing her voice now, soft and pleading, made my chest tighten with grief and longing. Michael. Her voice whispered through the storm. Michael, it's me, please. I sat frozen in my bunk staring at the door as the sound echoed through the cabin. It felt so real, so much like her, that for a moment I almost got up, almost walked to the door and flung it open just to see her face one more time. The need was physical, a hunger that gnawed at my insides. "Don't listen to it," Redfeather said from across the room. His voice was calm but firm, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. "It's not her. It can never be her." I nodded slowly and forced myself to look away from the door, though Sarah's voice continued to call to me, increasingly desperate, increasingly angry as the night wore on. By morning, the storm had calmed down a little, but the tension inside the cabin was worse than ever. None of us spoke much as we ate breakfast, if you could call it that. We were running low on supplies, and all we had left were a few cans of beans and some stale crackers that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. "We need to do something," Peterson said suddenly, breaking the silence, her face haggard from lack of sleep. "What do you suggest?" I asked, rubbing my eyes, which felt like they were filled with sand. She hesitated before answering. "We go after it." Redfeather shook his head immediately. "That's exactly what it wants, so what?" Peterson snapped, her patience finally breaking. "We just sit here and wait for it to kill us one by one? Wait until we're too weak from hunger to fight back? Wait until it wears us down and drives us mad? Is that your plan?" Redfeather didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out his book again and flipped to a page filled with drawings of symbols, similar to the ones we'd seen etched into the frost outside. "There's a way to stop it," he said quietly, his finger tracing one of the symbols. "How?" I asked, leaning forward, desperate for any solution that might end this nightmare. Redfeather pointed to one of the symbols, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, like a sun with sharp rays. "This is a purification ritual," he explained. "It can weaken the Wendigo enough for us to destroy it. What do we need for it?" Peterson asked eagerly, hope lighting her eyes for the first time in days. "Fire," Redfeather said simply, "and courage, and blood." Later that day, as we prepared for the ritual, gathering what supplies we could from around the cabin, something happened that shook us all to our core. Wright came back. It was just before sunset when we heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy, crunching through the snow toward the cabin. At first we thought it was another trick, the Wendigo mimicking his movements to lure us out. But when Peterson risked a peek through the window, her face went pale. "It's him," she whispered. "It's Wright." We gathered at the window, peering out into the gathering dusk, and there he was, standing in front of the cabin, just beyond the circle of herbs and ash Redfeather had laid down. His face was pale, almost blue with cold, and his clothing was torn and stained with something dark that might have been blood. But what struck me most was his expression, blank, empty, like there was nothing behind his eyes at all. "We have to let him in," Peterson said, already moving toward the door, but Redfeather grabbed her arm and stopped her before she could get too close. "Wait," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving Wright's motionless figure. "What are you talking about?" She argued, trying to pull away. "It's him. He's alive." Redfeather didn't let go of her arm. Instead, he stepped forward cautiously and looked at Wright through the window. "Where have you been?" he asked calmly, his voice carrying through the glass. Wright didn't answer right away. He just stood there staring at us like he didn't recognize us, like we were strangers. "Or pray, Wright," I said softly, stepping forward alongside Redfeather. "Are you okay?" Finally he spoke, but his voice was strange, hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere deep and cold. "I got lost," he said simply, the words flat and emotionless. Redfeather narrowed his eyes at him. "What happened in the woods?" Wright hesitated before answering, his gaze sliding past us to fix on something only he could see. "I don't remember." Peterson tried to move closer again, but Redfeather stopped her once more. "Look at his hands," he whispered to me. I glanced down at Wright's hands and felt my stomach drop. His fingers were pale, almost white, and covered in frostbite so severe that parts of his skin looked blackened and necrotic. But what really scared me were his nails. They were longer than they should have been, almost claw-like, curved and sharp at the ends like talons. "He's not Wright anymore," Redfeather said quietly, just loud enough for Peterson and me to hear. "It's inside him now." "No," Peterson said firmly, shaking her head in denial. "That's ridiculous. He needs help. He needs to come inside before he freezes to death." Before any of us could say or do anything else, Wright suddenly moved, faster than should have been possible, a blur of motion that ended with him pressed against the window, his face inches from ours. separated only by a thin pane of glass. His eyes were different now, hollow with that same bluish glow I'd seen in the figure watching us from the forest. And his mouth stretched into a grin too wide for his face, revealing teeth that seemed sharper, more numerous than before. "Let me in," he said, his voice no longer Wright's, but something ancient and hungry. "I'm so cold, so hungry." Peterson screamed and stumbled backward, her skepticism finally shattered by the inhuman thing wearing Wright's face. I reached for my pistol, knowing it was useless but needing to do something, anything. The thing that had been Wright slammed its fist against the window, the glass cracking but not breaking. Then it began to laugh, a high keening sound that made my bones ache with cold. "The hunger never stops," it said, its voice still containing echoes of Wright but twisted, distorted. "It gets inside you, hollows you out until there's nothing left but the need to feed." "Get away from the window," Redfeather ordered, pulling us back as the creature struck the glass again, the crack spreading like frost across the pane. "It's getting in," Peterson gasped, her face white with terror. "We need to complete the ritual," Redfeather said urgently, "now before it's too late." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness. And in that darkness I could see more shapes moving. Tall, thin figures with glowing eyes gathering around our cabin like wolves surrounding wounded prey. The Wendigo hadn't come alone. It had brought others of its kind, or perhaps it had made more of its kind from the people who had vanished from these woods over the years. The Johanssons, other rangers, all of them now hollow-eyed hunters in an endless winter night. Wright, or the thing that had been Wright, continued to pound on the window, each impact sending spiderweb cracks through the glass. "It wouldn't hold for long." "Nothing would. We're running out of time," I said, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. Redfeather nodded grimly and began to draw the symbols from his book on the floor of the cabin. Spirals and sharp lines, ancient wards against hunger and cold. Our last defense against the darkness pressing in around us. Outside, the creatures howled in unison, a sound like wind through dead trees, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, like the last breath of someone dying alone in the cold. They were calling to us, inviting us to join them in their endless hunger. And part of me, God help me, wanted to answer. The cabin felt colder than ever that night. Even with the fire burning, it was like the chill had seeped into our bones, into our souls. None of us spoke much after what happened with Wright, or what used to be Wright. Peterson sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, her face pale and her hands trembling. She'd emptied her pistol at the thing wearing Wright's face when it had finally broken through the window. But the bullets had only slowed it down long enough for us to barricade ourselves in the back room of the cabin. We could still hear it out there, moving around the main room, occasionally scratching at the door that separated us like a cat toying with cornered mice. Sometimes it would call to us in Wright's voice, pleading for help. Other times it would use Sarah's voice, making my heart clench with grief and longing. And sometimes it would speak in a voice I'd never heard before, ancient and cold and hungry. Redfeather was focused on preparing for the ritual, carefully drawing symbols on the floor with ash and charcoal, working by the dim light of our emergency lantern. The symbols formed a complex pattern, a spiral surrounded by jagged rays contained within a circle. At 5 points around the circle, he placed small bundles of herbs and what looked like bone fragments, murmuring words in a language I didn't understand as he worked. I tried to help him, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the chalk. The cold seemed to be getting worse, frost forming on the walls and ceiling of the small room, creeping toward us like grasping fingers. "What happens if this doesn't work?" I asked quietly, watching my breath form clouds in the freezing air. Redfeather paused for a moment before answering, his dark eyes meeting mine. "Then we don't make it through the night." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I didn't know what scared me more, the thought of facing the Wendigo or the possibility that we might already be too late, that we might already be claimed by it, marked for transformation into hollow-eyed hunters in the endless winter night. As midnight approached, Redfeather finished drawing the symbols and lit a small fire in the center of the circle, using a bundle of sage and cedar. The smoke filled the room with a sharp, earthy smell that seemed to cut through the icy air, momentarily pushing back the unnatural cold that had invaded our shelter. "This will keep it out for now," he said, gesturing to the symbols around us. but we need to lure it closer if we're going to stop it. How do we do that? Peterson asked nervously, her eyes darting to the door where the scratching had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Redfeather looked at me. It's been calling your name, he said. It wants you. I felt my stomach twist with fear. You want me to go out there? No, Redfeather said firmly. But you need to speak to it. Call it here, I stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? What if it gets inside? It won't, he said confidently. As long as we stay inside this circle, we're safe. The symbols will hold it back. I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't have a better plan. So I took a deep breath, stepped to the edge of the circle, and shouted into the darkness beyond the door. Come on, I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. I know you're out there. Show yourself! For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then slowly I heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching the door. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with every step. Not the sound of human feet, but something else. Something that walked differently, with a gait that was both fluid and wrong somehow, like limbs bending in ways they weren't meant to bend. It's coming, Redfeather said calmly, though I could see the tension in his shoulders as he stood ready, a knife in one hand and a burning bundle of herbs in the other. Peterson grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the center of the circle as we all stared at the door. The temperature in the room dropped even further, so cold that it burned my skin. The lantern flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of their sources. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap on the wood, but it quickly grew louder and more insistent until it sounded like someone was trying to break down the door with inhuman strength. Michael, a voice called from outside. It was Sarah's voice again, soft and pleading just like before. Michael, please let me in. I'm so cold. I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay where I was, though every instinct screamed at me to open the door to see her face one more time. To hold her. It's not her, Redfeather said firmly, his eyes locked on the door. Remember that. No matter what it says, no matter what it sounds like, it's not her. The pounding on the door grew louder, the wood beginning to splinter under the force of the blows. And then the voice changed, becoming something inhuman, a rasping, gurgling sound like water running beneath ice. We are hunger, it said, its voice echoing strangely in the small room. We are cold. We are forever. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and there it stood, the Wendigo in all its terrible glory. It was tall, so tall it had to stoop to enter the room, its limbs elongated and jointed in too many places. Its skin was a pale bluish white, stretched tight over its bones like a drum, and its face. God, its face was barely human anymore. Hollow eyes glowing with that unnatural phosphorescence, a mouth too wide filled with needle-like teeth, and atop its head, a crown of antlers that scraped the ceiling as it moved. Behind it, I could see more shapes moving in the darkness of the outer room. Wright, or what had been Wright, and other figures, all with the same hollow eyes and hungry expressions. But the Wendigo itself was different. Older, more powerful, the source of the hunger that had consumed the others. Now, Redfeather shouted, throwing his bundle of burning herbs at the creature's feet. The flames caught with a whoosh, burning with an intense blue light that made the Wendigo shriek. A sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake, like wind howling through dead trees. It recoiled from the fire but didn't retreat, instead circling the edge of our protective symbols, testing for weaknesses. Keep the fire going, Redfeather instructed, his voice calm despite the horror facing us. The ritual will work as long as the flames burn. Peterson and I fed the central fire with the prepared bundles of herbs, the smoke growing thicker and more aromatic, filling the room with a haze that seemed to keep the creatures at bay. Redfeather began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that made my ears ring and my vision blur slightly. The Wendigo circled us, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a predator studying its prey. It spoke again, its voice now a chorus of all the people it had taken. Wright, the Johanssons, Sarah, all of them speaking through its mouth in a terrible cacophony. You will join us, it said, its hollow eyes fixed on me. You will know the hunger. You will hunt with us in the endless winter. Don't listen, Redfeather warned, not breaking his chant. It lies. It can only take you if you let it in. The ritual continued, the smoke growing thicker, the fire burning hotter. The symbols on the floor began to glow with an inner light of their own, pulsing in time with Redfeather's chants. The Wendigo seemed agitated now, moving faster around the circle, occasionally lunging toward us only to be repelled by an invisible barrier created by the symbols. "It's working," Peterson whispered, hope breaking through the fear in her voice. But then something happened that none of us expected. The Wendigo stopped its pacing and stood completely still, its hollow eyes fixed on Peterson. And then it spoke again, this time in a voice I didn't recognize, a man's voice, deep and warm. "Jenny," it said softly. "Jenny, it's me. It's Dad." Peterson went rigid beside me, her face draining of all color. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice small and childlike. "Don't listen," I said urgently, grabbing her arm. "It's not him. It's trying to trick you." But there was something in her eyes, a longing, a hunger of her own, something I recognized because I'd felt it too when I heard Sarah's voice. "Jenny, I've missed you so much," the Wendigo continued, its voice a perfect imitation of someone it had no right to know. "Come with me. It doesn't hurt anymore. I'm not sick anymore." Peterson took a step toward the edge of the circle, her eyes fixed on the creature as if in a trance. "Peterson, no!" I shouted, reaching for her, but it was too late. She stepped out of the circle. "Peterson, no!" I shouted, reaching for her, but it was too late. She turned to look at me with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered before walking toward the Wendigo. The creature let out a low growl as she approached it. Its hollow eyes locked onto her like a predator watching its prey. For a moment, she just stood there in front of it, frozen in place, before it lunged forward and grabbed her by the shoulders. Her scream echoed through the cabin as they both disappeared into the darkness outside. "No," I yelled, starting to run after her, but Redfeather grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the circle. "There's nothing you can do for her now," he said quietly, his face grave but determined. "Stay in the circle. Complete the ritual. It's the only way." I wanted to argue with him, to fight back, but deep down I knew he was right. Peterson was gone, just like Wright. Just like the Johanssons, just like all the others who had disappeared in these woods over the years. There was nothing we could do for her now except make sure her fate didn't become ours as well. For what felt like hours after that, we stayed huddled inside our circle while Redfeather continued his chants. The Wendigo circled us like a wolf stalking its prey, snarling and clawing at our barriers but never crossing them. Sometimes it would take Peterson's form, calling to us in her voice. Other times it would appear as Wright or Sarah, or people I didn't recognize, all of them begging us to join them, to end our resistance, to give in to the hunger. But we held firm, feeding the fire, maintaining the circle, even as our strength began to wane and the cold seeped deeper into our bones. Outside, the storm raged on, shaking the cabin with its fury. Or perhaps it was the Wendigo and its transformed victims, trying to tear down our shelter plank by plank. Finally, as dawn began to break over the horizon, sending pale gray light filtering through the cracks in the walls, Redfeather's chant reached a crescendo. He shouted a final phrase in that ancient language, his voice cracking with the effort, and threw the last of the herbs into the fire. The flames shot upward, touching the ceiling before spreading outward in a wave of blue-white light that filled the room. The Wendigo let out an ear-piercing scream before vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but silence and frost-covered walls. The other shapes that had gathered outside our circle, Wright, Peterson, and the others disappeared as well, melting away like snow in the sun. "It's gone," Redfeather said quietly as he slumped to his knees in exhaustion. "For now." I helped him to his feet, both of us trembling with cold and fatigue. Outside, the storm had stopped and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The unbearable cold that had gripped the forest seemed to be receding, the ice on the windows already beginning to melt in the morning light. "Is it over?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Redfeather shook his head slowly. "The ritual banished it, weakened it, but it will return. The Wendigo is ancient. It cannot truly die. It can only be sent back to the darkness from which it came." "And the others?" "Peterson, Wright." His eyes were sad as he met my gaze. "They're gone. Their bodies may still walk these woods, but their souls..." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. We gathered what supplies we could salvage from the destroyed cabin and began the long trek back to civilization. The forest seemed different now, quieter but not with the unnatural silence of before. I could hear birds again and the distant howl of a wolf that sounded blessedly normal. Life returning to the woods as the Wendigo's influence receded. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. That somewhere out there in those frozen woods it was still waiting, weakened but not defeated, watching, hungry, patient. And in the deepest part of the night, when the wind whistles through the trees and temperatures plummet, I sometimes think I can still hear it, a voice calling my name with terrible longing, inviting me to join the hunt in the endless winter night. I know now why Redfeather carried that book with him, why he knew so much about the Wendigo. He had faced it before, perhaps many times over the years, a guardian standing watch against an ancient hunger that never truly dies. As for me, I've requested a transfer to a ranger station in Arizona, somewhere hot and dry, where the only thing I have to worry about is wildfires and the occasional lost hiker. But no matter how far south I go, no matter how warm the sun, I can never quite shake the cold that settled into my bones during those terrible days in the Boundary Waters. And sometimes, in my dreams I see them, Peterson and Wright and all the others, their eyes hollow and hungry, moving through an endless snowfall, hunting, always hungry. Field Journal Entry 137, Denali National Park Glaciology Station, Dr. Catherine Norwood, Senior Glaciologist, March 17, 1976. The isolation of Denali National Park suits me perfectly. As the senior glaciologist stationed at the northernmost research outpost, I've found that the vast emptiness of Alaska's frozen wilderness provides both scientific opportunity and personal sanctuary. Most people call me Kate, those few who speak to me at all. My tiny research station clings to the edge of the Muldrow Glacier like a barnacle on the hull of a massive ship. The structure is utilitarian, 4 rooms with metal walls that contract and groan in the sub-zero temperatures, windows reinforced against winds that can reach hurricane force, and a small observatory deck where I spend hours documenting the slow dance of ice and time. 3 years ago, my life collapsed like a poorly constructed ice shelf. My ex-husband David and our son Michael died in a climbing accident in Colorado. The weather turned suddenly, as mountain weather does. And while I was up here studying glacial retreat patterns, they were being buried beneath tons of snow and rock. The rescue team found them 3 days later, frozen together in a final embrace. I've spent every day since wondering if I could have saved them had I been there. That guilt has become part of me, crystallizing around my heart like permafrost. So now I bury myself in my work, far from anyone who might care about me. It's easier this way. The winter thaw has come faster than anyone expected this year. By early March, snow was already melting at record speed, exposing strange ice formations across the valley floor. The scientific community is buzzing with theories about accelerated glacial retreat, but something about these formations troubles me on a visceral level. This morning, I ventured out to photograph one of these structures, tall spires of ice that resembled frozen waves crashing toward the sky. The patterns were unlike anything I'd documented in 15 years of glaciology. The ice didn't fracture along expected crystalline structures. Instead, it seemed almost organic, as though it had grown rather than formed. The striation patterns reminded me of muscle tissue viewed under a microscope. My days follow a predictable pattern. I rise before dawn, check my instruments, collect ice core samples, document wildlife migration or lack thereof, and process data until my eyes burn. Human contact is limited to 3 voices. Marcus Holden, the park's radio operator stationed at headquarters 50 miles south, checks in every evening at precisely 7 p.m. His voice crackles through the static, always beginning with the same joke. "Still alive up there in the ice palace, Your Majesty." Marcus is kind but painfully optimistic, the type who believes every problem can be solved with the right attitude. He doesn't understand why I choose this solitude, but he respects it enough not to push. Jack Ryder pilots the supply helicopter once a month, landing on the small pad 100 yards from my station. He's gruff, efficient, and mercifully uninterested in small talk. He delivers what I need and leaves without asking about my research or personal life. His silence is a gift. Then there's Enyu Takakok, an indigenous guide who occasionally visits to share his people's knowledge of the land. Unlike the others, Enyu understands silence. He speaks softly but carries wisdom that demands attention. During his last visit, as we watched the aurora dance overhead, he told me something that continues to haunt me. These mountains have secrets older than time itself. Some should remain buried beneath the ice, and something feels wrong about this thaw. The air carries a metallic tang that burns the back of my throat, and the wildlife has grown unnaturally scarce. Yesterday I noticed the valley was completely silent. No birds singing, no foxes darting across the snow, no sign of the caribou herds that typically migrate through this area in early spring. Even the ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. Natural cycles fluctuate, of course, that's basic ecology. But in 15 years of field research, I've never experienced such complete absence of wildlife. It's as though every living creature suddenly decided to evacuate. At night, the silence is even more oppressive. The wind whispers around the corners of my station with a voice that sometimes sounds disturbingly like my son's. I find myself straining to hear what it's trying to tell me, only to be met with emptiness that rings in my ears until I force myself to sleep. My research equipment has been acting strangely, too. Temperature sensors show bizarre fluctuations, dropping 20 degrees in areas where the ice is actively melting. Seismic monitors detect microtremors that don't match any known geological pattern. It's as though the glacier itself is shivering. I've reported these anomalies to the National Science Foundation, but they've dismissed my concerns as equipment malfunctions. Perhaps they're right. Maybe isolation is finally corroding my scientific objectivity. Still, as I stand on the observation deck watching the midnight sun cast long shadows across the ice field, I can't shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent is stirring beneath the melting glacier. The rational part of my mind dismisses this as melodramatic nonsense, the product of grief and isolation. But another part, something primitive and instinctual, whispers a warning I can't quite ignore. Tomorrow I'll venture deeper into the valley to investigate the unusual ice formations. The forecast calls for clear weather, and I need core samples from those structures. Perhaps scientific data will quiet these irrational fears. But tonight, as I prepare for bed, I double-check the locks on my doors and windows. Out here, surrounded by hundreds of miles of wilderness, such precautions are objectively pointless. Yet I find myself unable to sleep without them, because deep down, beneath layers of scientific training and rational thought, I know something is waking up in the melting ice, and whatever it is, it doesn't belong in this world. The thaw continued at an alarming rate over the next few days. The glacier seemed to be shedding its icy skin faster than I'd ever documented, revealing strange blue-black patches beneath the surface like bruises on pale flesh. I spent most of my time hiking through the valley, photographing the changes and collecting samples that showed inexplicable cellular structures when viewed under my microscope. On the third day of my expedition, something unusual caught my eye. A dark, elongated shape buried deep in the ice near the glacier's eastern edge. From a distance, it resembled a fallen tree or perhaps a large rock, perfectly preserved in the frozen tomb. But as I approached, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was neither tree nor rock. I dropped to my knees beside the ice sheet, brushing away the loose snow with hands that suddenly felt clumsy in their thick gloves. What lay beneath was unmistakably organic, a carcass of some kind, but unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. The creature was massive, at least 15 feet long and nearly 7 feet at the shoulder. Its body was twisted in an unnatural position, as though it had been writhing in agony when the ice claimed it. The visible skin had a strange bluish-black tint that seemed to shimmer with iridescence even beneath layers of frozen water. I fumbled with my camera, trying to steady my trembling hands as I adjusted the focus. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that made my stomach clench. The creature's limbs were disproportionately long and muscular, ending in hooked claws that resembled surgical scalpels more than natural appendages. Each claw was serrated along one edge and looked capable of slicing through steel. Its head was broad and flat, with a pronounced ridge running from snout to crown. Deep-set eye sockets housed frozen orbs the color of Arctic ice, with vertical pupils like a cat's. But it was the mouth that made me recoil, a gaping maw filled with row upon row of teeth resembling shattered glass, each one translucent as though formed from ice itself. The creature's anatomy defied classification. It possessed features of both predatory mammals and reptiles, yet belonged to neither category. I estimated it weighed at least 1,200 pounds in life, with a skeletal structure unlike anything in the fossil record. As I photographed the specimen, A disturbing thought took root in my mind. The ice surrounding the creature was old, possibly tens of thousands of years old based on depth and composition. Yet the organic material showed no signs of decomposition beyond what might be expected after a few weeks. It was as though time itself had been suspended around this thing. More unsettling still, the ice immediately surrounding the carcass was different, denser, darker, with a crystalline structure that resembled frozen blood vessels radiating outward from the body. It was almost as if the creature had altered its environment even in death. I radioed Marcus immediately, my voice higher and tighter than I intended. "Marcus, I found something unusual in the eastern quadrant." His voice crackled through the static, calm and curious. "Sounds like you've got yourself a mystery there, Kate. What kind of unusual are we talking about?" "Biological. A preserved specimen in the ice. Large, much larger than any known native species. I can't even begin to classify it. You sure it's not just some weird bear, maybe deformed by the preservation process?" "No," I replied firmly. "This isn't a bear. It's something else entirely. I need a team out here. Paleontologists, cryptozoologists, whatever you can arrange." Marcus promised to alert the Park Service and send someone to investigate. But with the abnormal thaw causing flooding downstream and stretching resources thin, I knew it could be days before anyone arrived. In the meantime, I collected ice samples from around the specimen and marked the location with survey flags. As the Arctic sun began its leisurely descent toward the horizon, I noticed something odd about the ice encasing the creature. Hairline fractures had appeared along its length, radiating outward like a spiderweb. I was certain they hadn't been there when I'd first discovered the specimen hours earlier. The wind picked up as I made my final measurements, carrying with it a sound I couldn't quite identify. Something between a whistle and a moan, originating from somewhere within the glacier itself. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath crystallizing in front of my face despite the fact that it was nearly May. I hurried back to my station as darkness fell, an irrational dread dogging my footsteps. Once inside, I uploaded my photographs to the computer and began analyzing the samples I'd collected. Under the microscope, the ice revealed structures that resembled cellular material, not fossilized remains, but intact cells with nuclei and what appeared to be mitochondria. Impossible for something so ancient. That night, as I sat reviewing the photos, I heard something outside, a low rumbling that made the station's walls vibrate. At first, I dismissed it as wind, but it came again, deeper and more guttural, sending chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the perimeter. The beam reflected off the snow, creating a disorienting glare that made it difficult to see clearly. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, unusual even for this region, and the air felt heavy, charged with an almost electrical energy. That's when I noticed them. Tracks leading away from the site where I'd discovered the creature. Massive impressions in the snow, each one at least twice the size of my boot prints. The stride length was impossibly long, nearly 8 feet between prints. Whatever made them was bipedal but moved with an unnatural gait. I followed the tracks across the ice field, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me until I reached the spot where I'd found the carcass. My survey flag still stood in a precise circle, but the center was empty. The creature was gone. The ice where it had been entombed had melted completely, leaving behind a pool of liquid that couldn't possibly be water. It was too viscous, too dark, and it moved with an almost purposeful undulation when my flashlight beam touched it. The liquid shimmered with the same iridescent quality I'd observed on the creature's skin. The tracks led away from this pool and continued northward, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my light. I considered following them, but stopped myself. Whatever had made those tracks was moving fast, covering ground with a speed that suggested predatory intent. I backed away slowly, keeping my light trained on the strange liquid pool. As I watched, its surface suddenly froze solid, crystallizing into patterns that resembled the same cellular structures I'd observed in my samples. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the station's walls, every gust of wind made me jolt upright, reaching for the hunting rifle I'd placed beside my bed. When Marcus called for his nightly check-in, I told him what had happened. "Kate," he said slowly, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it, "you need to be careful out there. Whatever you found, just stay inside until we can get someone to you." "I know," I replied quietly. not mentioning that it might already be too late for caution. After we disconnected, I pulled up the photographs I'd taken earlier that day. As I zoomed in on the creature's face, I noticed something I'd missed during my initial examination. Its eyes, though seemingly frozen, contained tiny fractures radiating from the pupils. In the last photograph, taken just before I left the site, those fractures had expanded, almost as if the eyes had been preparing to open. The next morning, Enyu Takakok arrived unexpectedly at my station. He rarely ventured this far into the wilderness unless something important demanded his attention. His weathered face was drawn tight with tension, eyes darting nervously to the windows as though expecting something to crash through the glass at any moment. "You found something," he said simply, not a question. I nodded and showed him one of the photographs on my camera's display screen. His breath caught audibly as he stared at the image of the creature. He touched the screen with trembling fingers, tracing the outline of the thing's elongated limbs and jagged teeth. "That's Tornet," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tornet? It's an old story. Very old." Enyu settled into a chair, his gaze never leaving the camera screen. "My people believed there were predators here long before humans, giants who lived within the ice and hunted during warm seasons, then returned to sleep when winter came. The elders called them Tornet, the cold hunters." I wanted to dismiss his words as folklore, just another indigenous legend born from the harsh realities of Arctic survival. But something in his tone made me hesitate. The fear in his eyes wasn't the abstract dread of ancient myths. It was immediate and visceral. "The stories say they cannot be killed by blade or bullet," Enyu continued. "Their flesh is like ice itself. It melts and reforms, heals any wound. They hunt not just for hunger, but for pleasure. They take their prey back to their frozen dens and keep them alive, feeding slowly over many weeks." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Enyu, the creature I found, was dead. Frozen in the ice. He shook his head slowly. "Not dead. Never dead. Only sleeping. When the ice melts, they wake. That's not possible. Nothing could survive being frozen solid for thousands of years. They are not like animals you study, Catherine." It was the first time he'd ever used my full name. "They are not like anything else on Earth. They remember the time before humans when the world was covered in ice. They hate us for bringing warmth to their hunting grounds." Before leaving, Enyu looked me straight in the eye and said one last thing. "Be ready. It will come for you now. It knows you have seen it." The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. Tornet, as Enyu had called it. The tracks I'd found haunted my thoughts, and the eerie silence in the valley only deepened. It felt as though the entire landscape was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. I tried to focus on my work, but even the familiar routines of sample collection and data analysis felt wrong. The ice cores I extracted contained strange anomalies. Microscopic structures that resembled nerve cells, but with crystalline components integrated into their structure. The wildlife remained conspicuously absent. Not a single bird or mammal in sight. The weather grew increasingly erratic. Sudden gusts of Arctic wind would sweep through the valley without warning, carrying with them a sound like distant screaming. The temperature fluctuated wildly, dropping 40 degrees in minutes, then rising again just as rapidly. At night, I'd hear faint noises outside the station, scraping sounds like claws dragging across metal, and rhythmic thumping that resembled massive footsteps circling my shelter. I told myself it was just my imagination, my mind manufacturing threats from Enyu's stories. But deep down I knew better. On the fourth evening after discovering the creature, I received alarming news over the radio. Jack Ryder's helicopter had crashed while attempting to deliver supplies to another research station 20 miles south. When rescuers finally reached him hours later, he was barely alive and suffering from severe frostbite, despite having been equipped with cold weather survival gear. According to Marcus, Jack kept muttering the same phrases repeatedly while the medical team treated him. Ice that moves and storm with eyes. His condition was critical, with frostbite so severe that doctors predicted he would lose several fingers and possibly both feet. "Kate," Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. "Jack swears something chased him. Said the sky cleared, then this thing appeared on the ice below. Nearly 12 feet tall, he said. Moved so fast he could barely keep track of it. Then this localized blizzard formed around the helicopter, like the storm was following him." The instruments froze solid and he went down. I felt my blood run cold. "When is the rescue team coming for me?" A long pause. "That's the thing, Kate. With Jack's chopper down and the thaw causing flooding downriver, all resources are diverted to evacuation efforts. It could be a week, maybe more." That night was worse than any before. The noises outside grew louder, scraping sounds mixed with low growls that seemed to come from all directions at once. At one point, I heard something tapping on the walls of the station in a steady rhythm, almost like Morse code. It didn't make any sense, but it sent chills down my spine. I slept with my rifle across my lap, waking at every sound. Around 3 a.m., the temperature inside the station plummeted so rapidly that my breath frosted in the air despite the heaters running at full capacity. The windows developed a layer of ice on the inside, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like staring eyes. Then, just before dawn, I saw it. I was checking the perimeter sensors when I spotted movement on the far side of the glacier. At first, it was just a shadow, something tall and unnaturally thin moving between the ice formations. My heart pounded against my ribs as I raised my binoculars to get a closer look. The creature stood at least 12 feet tall, its bluish skin almost luminescent against the white snow. Its body was lean but powerfully built, with elongated limbs that ended in the same vicious claws I'd seen in the ice. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the frozen terrain as though weightless. For a moment it stopped and turned its head in my direction. I froze, barely breathing as its deep-set eyes scanned the area. The eyes glowed with a pale blue light, like bioluminescent algae in deep ocean trenches. I don't know if it saw me, but after several seconds that felt like eternity. It disappeared into the shadows between ice formations, moving with impossible speed. I ran back to the station and locked every door and window, my hands shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to secure the main entrance. The radio crackled with static when I tried to contact Marcus, the interference so severe that I could barely make out his voice. "Marcus," I said as soon as the connection stabilized. "It's alive." "What do you mean alive?" His voice sounded distant, breaking up between bursts of static. "The creature, the one from the ice. It's awake and it's out there right now." Marcus tried to calm me down, but there wasn't much he could do from 50 miles away. He promised to send help as soon as possible, but we both knew that with the current crisis, I was effectively on my own. That afternoon, strange clouds began gathering over the glacier, roiling masses of vapor that moved against the prevailing winds. They formed shapes that resembled massive hands reaching down toward the ice field. The temperature continued to drop, reaching 30 below zero despite it being May. I spent the evening reinforcing my station's defenses as best I could, boarding up windows, barricading doors, and setting up makeshift alarms using tin cans and fishing line around the perimeter. It wasn't much, but it might give me warning if the creature approached. As darkness fell, the radio picked up strange transmissions, fragments of conversations that couldn't possibly be happening. I heard voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, interspersed with what sounded like my son Michael's laughter. When I tried to contact Marcus, all I got was a continuous loop of someone whispering my name, over and over again. I knew then that I was truly alone against whatever had awakened in the ice. Desperate for answers, I decided to explore the ice caves Enyu had mentioned during one of his earlier visits. He'd told me they were sacred places where his ancestors sought shelter during harsh winters, their walls inscribed with the history of his people. If Tornet was part of their stories, perhaps there was something in those caves that could help me understand what I was facing. I set out at dawn, armed with my rifle, useless as it might be according to Enyu, several flares, and a backpack containing emergency supplies. The morning was unnaturally still, the air so cold it burned my lungs with each breath. My footsteps echoed across the frozen landscape, the only sound in a world gone silent. The entrance to the caves was partially hidden beneath a shelf of overhanging ice, a dark mouth exhaling plumes of vapor into the frigid air. I activated a flare and stepped inside, the red glow casting dancing shadows across walls of ancient ice. The temperature dropped immediately as I ventured deeper, far colder than the ambient air outside should allow. My breath emerged in thick clouds that hung motionless before slowly crystallizing and falling to the ground like snow. The walls around me glittered with frozen crystals that reflected my light in hypnotic patterns, creating the disorienting sensation that the entire cavern was somehow alive, watching me with countless faceted eyes. The passage narrowed, then widened into a vast chamber whose ceiling rose beyond the reach of my light. Massive icicles hung from above like crystal teeth, some as thick as ancient redwoods. The floor sloped downward toward a dark pool of liquid that remained unfrozen despite the extreme cold. Another impossibility in this environment. As I circled the chamber, my light fell upon something that made me stumble backward in horror. Human remains, dozens of them frozen into the very walls of the cave. Men, women, even small children perfectly preserved as if they'd been trapped there only yesterday, their faces contorted in expressions of primal terror. I approached the nearest body, that of a man wearing what appeared to be a military uniform from the 1940s. His eyes were open wide, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. One arm extended from the ice as though reaching desperately for escape, fingers curled into claws. What struck me most was the unnatural positioning of his limbs, bent at impossible angles, bones clearly broken in multiple places before death. Beside him was a woman in traditional native clothing, her face painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Her body was similarly distorted, spine arched backward at a severe angle that could only have been achieved through devastating injury. I felt sick as I realized what this meant. These weren't victims of some natural disaster, preserved by chance in the ice. They had been placed here deliberately, arranged like grotesque trophies. The Tornet hadn't just killed these people, it had hunted them, broken them, and preserved them as some kind of macabre collection. Before leaving the chamber, I noticed strange markings carved into the ice walls near the bodies, symbols that resembled no language I'd ever encountered. They formed spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse and shift when viewed from different angles, creating the nauseating illusion of movement. I photographed as many as I could, hands trembling so badly I could barely operate the camera. As I turned to leave, my light swept across something that stopped me cold, a crude painting on the far wall, ancient beyond reckoning. It depicted tall, elongated figures surrounding small human forms. The taller beings were shown with one hand extended toward the sky, where a spiral symbol dominated the scene. Beneath the painting, more recent carvings showed similar creatures emerging from what appeared to be melting ice, their arms reaching for fleeing human figures, a warning. Passed down through generations, when the ice melts, they return. I made my way back to the station as quickly as possible, constantly checking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was following just beyond the reach of my vision. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it that same strange moaning sound I'd heard before. Upon my return, I found Enyu waiting for me, his face even grimmer than during our last meeting. He carried a weathered leather folder filled with yellowed documents, government records from 1943, marked with military classification stamps that had long since expired. These were my grandfather's, he explained, spreading the papers across my desk. He was translator for Army during war. These reports were hidden, buried in archives. I have contact who found them for me. The documents detailed a military exercise gone horribly wrong in the winter of 1943. A squad of 14 soldiers had been sent to establish a weather monitoring station near our current location. Within days of their arrival, they began reporting strange sightings, massive footprints in the snow, equipment that froze solid despite being kept in heated tents, and unexplained deaths. The files described 3 soldiers found frozen to death inside their tent. Despite the stove still burning when they were discovered, their bodies showed unusual breakage patterns consistent with being crushed by tremendous force, yet there were no external wounds. Another soldier vanished while on patrol, only to be found 2 days later suspended upside down from an ice formation, his body completely drained of blood through small, precise incisions. Most disturbing were the photographs attached to the reports, grainy black and white images showing exactly the same type of creature I'd encountered. In one photo, the thing stood at the edge of an ice field, its proportions making the military jeep in the foreground look like a child's toy. They tried to fight it, Enyu said quietly. They used guns, grenades, even flamethrowers. Nothing worked. It killed them one by one until only the commander remained. His final report described a storm that followed him for miles, a blizzard that seemed to think. The commander's last communication was a hastily scrawled note. It is intelligent. It learns, God help us all. According to the documents, the military subsequently classified the entire incident and abandoned the area, citing unsuitable terrain for strategic operations. No further expeditions were authorized. The Tornet, or the Frostwalker, as these papers call it, isn't just a predator, NU continued. It's something ancient and patient. The documents suggest it wakes during warm periods, hunting to prepare for its next hibernation cycle. It needs organic material with specific properties to survive the long freezing. Is there any way to kill it? I asked, my voice barely audible. NU hesitated before answering. Heat, he said finally, and salt. The soldiers discovered this by accident when one managed to wound it with a flare gun. Their scientific officer theorized that its cellular structure is similar to ice itself, but far more complex. Extreme heat disrupts its ability to maintain cohesion, and salt, like what we use on icy roads, prevents it from reforming. It wasn't much, but it was something, a weakness I could potentially exploit. I decided then that I wouldn't wait passively for rescue or death. I would fight back. I spent the remainder of the day rigging heating elements around the station's perimeter, creating a thermal barrier using parts scavenged from spare equipment. I also prepared buckets of heavily salted water, positioning them near every entrance. The salt supplies meant for keeping pathways clear during winter would serve a different purpose now. Marcus called in that evening as usual, his voice steady despite my increasingly desperate situation. Kate, he said after I'd explained my preparations, you need to get out of there. Forget the research, forget the station. Just grab what you can carry and start hiking south. I can have a team meet you halfway. I can't, I replied firmly. If this thing gets out of the valley, who knows what it might do? The thaw is accelerating. There could be more of them waking up. Someone needs to document this to warn people. Marcus didn't argue, but I could hear the worry in his voice as he signed off. I wondered if I'd ever speak to him again. As night fell, I positioned myself in the observation room with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Hours passed in tense silence as I watched the moonlight cast long shadows across the ice field. Nothing moved. Even the wind had died completely, creating an unnatural stillness that pressed against my ears like physical pressure. I must have dozed off briefly because I jerked awake suddenly, every nerve in my body screaming danger. Something had changed. The air inside the station had grown so cold that ice crystals formed on the inner walls, creeping across the surface in fractal patterns that seemed to form and reform into faces. My son's face, my ex-husband's, Marcus's, all watching me with empty, accusatory eyes. Then I heard it, a sound no human throat could produce, a deep resonant call that vibrated through the station's structure, rattling equipment and shattering a coffee mug that sat on the desk beside me. It was coming. And somehow I knew it wasn't hunting for food anymore. It was hunting for me. That night the storm came. It began with a low rumble that shook the station's foundations, a sound more felt than heard, like the heartbeat of some colossal beast. Then the wind rose with unnatural speed, howling around the building with a voice that seemed to form words just beyond the threshold of comprehension. Snow slammed against the windows in sheets so thick they obliterated the world outside, transforming my small outpost into an island in a sea of howling whiteness. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost formed on the inside of the glass, creeping across the surface in patterns too orderly to be natural, geometric shapes that resembled the strange symbols I'd seen carved in the ice cave. I monitored the thermal perimeter I'd established, watching the readouts fluctuate wildly as the external temperature dropped beyond the equipment's ability to measure. The heating elements strained against the cold, many of them failing as their components froze and shattered. Hours passed in tense silence. I positioned myself near the main control panel, a bucket of salt water within reach, my father's old revolver in my coat pocket. Useless against the creature, perhaps, but its weight provided some small comfort. The station's emergency generator labored against the cold, its usual steady hum becoming an irregular stutter as fuel lines threatened to freeze. If it failed, the heating system would follow, and I knew that would be the end. Just after midnight, the radio crackled to life unexpectedly. Through bursts of static, I heard Marcus's voice and strained, breathless. Kate, coming to you. Stay inside. Marcus, don't. I shouted into the receiver. Stay where you are. It's too dangerous. No response came. Only a sustained burst of static followed by silence. At 2:17 a.m., the first attack came. Something massive struck the roof with enough force to dent the reinforced metal. Snow and ice cascaded past the windows as the thing moved across the top of the station, its weight causing the ceiling to bow inward. I heard claws scraping against the surface, testing for weaknesses. Then came the tapping, steady, rhythmic impacts against the walls and windows. Not random destruction, but deliberate communication. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It went on for nearly an hour, moving around the perimeter, always the same pattern. I realized with growing horror that it was mimicking the Morse code signal for SOS. It was learning, adapting, using human patterns against me. The attacks intensified as the night progressed. The creature seemed to be testing each section of the station, searching for structural weaknesses. The noise was psychological warfare as much as physical. Sometimes deafening impacts that made the walls buckle, other times barely audible scratching that set my teeth on edge. At 4:38 a.m., one of the perimeter sensors went dead. Then another. Something was methodically disabling my defenses. I checked the external temperature readout, 78 degrees and still dropping. No human could survive more than minutes in those conditions, even with the best Arctic gear. Yet something was moving out there with purpose and intelligence, unaffected by cold that would freeze flesh in seconds. At 5:23 a.m., the generator finally failed. The lights flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness broken only by the pale emergency lights. The heating system gave one final protesting groan before shutting down. Within minutes, my breath clouded before my face as the interior temperature began its inevitable decline. I knew then that the creature was waiting for this, for the cold to reclaim its domain, for my technological protections to crumble. I retreated to the boiler room, the only place I might be able to maintain enough heat to survive, and perhaps to fight. The ancient boiler was my last defense, a massive iron beast that burned diesel fuel to create steam for the station's heating system. Without electricity to power its control systems, I would have to operate it manually, risking explosion or fire, but I had no choice. I worked frantically by flashlight, bypassing safety systems and rerouting fuel lines. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with wrenches and screwdrivers. Twice I had to stop and warm my hands against the boiler's surface to prevent frostbite. As I worked, I heard a new sound, something heavy dragging across the snow outside, approaching the station from the north. Not the creature's footsteps, but something else. Something being hauled. Then came a crash from the rear of the station so powerful it shook the floor beneath my feet. The back door had been ripped away completely, allowing a torrent of snow and frigid air to pour into the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the noise, heart pounding against my ribs. In the middle of the swirling snow stood Marcus, his face pale and frozen with terror, his parka torn to shreds. Blood had frozen in dark trails down his face and neck. Before I could speak, he collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It followed me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Used me to find you." His skin was covered in frostbite, blackened patches spreading across his cheeks and forehead like ink spilled on paper. His eyes were wide with a fear beyond anything I'd ever seen in a human face. "It's here," he managed before his body went rigid, a final shuddering breath escaping his lips. I barely had time to process what had happened before another crash echoed through the station, this time from the front entrance. The creature had breached both access points, cutting off any possibility of escape. It was inside. I ran toward the boiler room, my only hope now to lure the creature into a space I could superheat. As I sprinted through the darkened hallways, I heard it moving behind me. Not the thunderous pursuit I expected, but something more deliberate and terrifying. It wasn't rushing. It didn't need to. The station's interior had already transformed into an Arctic landscape. Ice coated the walls and floor, making each step treacherous. My breath emerged in thick clouds that hung motionless in the air before slowly crystallizing and falling like snow. The creature's presence was changing the physical properties of the environment itself. I reached the boiler room and slammed the door shut, knowing it wouldn't hold for long. The temperature inside was marginally warmer thanks to the massive iron boiler, which still retained some heat. I cranked the manual valves to their maximum settings, bypassing every safety mechanism. The ancient machine groaned in protest as pressure built beyond recommended levels. Steam began hissing from overtaxed pipes, rapidly raising the room's temperature. Sweat beaded on my forehead even as ice continued forming. On the walls nearest the door, A bizarre environmental contradiction that defied basic physics. The door burst inward with such force that metal hinges tore free from the frame. The creature filled the doorway completely, its body even larger than when I'd glimpsed it across the glacier. Standing fully upright, it had to duck to enter the room, its head brushing against the 8-foot ceiling. In the boiler's orange glow, I saw it clearly for the first time. Its skin was translucent, revealing crystalline structures beneath that pulsed with blue-white energy. Its limbs were disproportionately long, jointed in ways that defied mammalian anatomy. Each hand ended in 5 serrated claws that appeared to be made of the same material as its teeth, something between ice and glass, but stronger than steel. Its face was a nightmare of evolutionary divergence. No nose, just 2 vertical slits where one should be. The mouth extended nearly ear to ear if it had had ears, filled with hundreds of needle-like teeth arranged in rotating rows like a shark's. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with primal terror. Large, slightly luminous orbs with vertical pupils that contracted to slits in the boiler's light. They were intelligent eyes, ancient and calculating. It regarded me silently for a moment, head tilted slightly as though puzzled by my existence. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a series of clicks and moans that somehow conveyed meaning directly to my mind. Small, warm thing. Last of your kind here. The others I have taken. The telepathic intrusion was so unexpected, so alien, that I stumbled backward against the boiler, scalding my hand on an exposed pipe. The pain shocked me back to reality. What do you want? I demanded, voice trembling despite my efforts to sound brave. To feed. To learn. To sleep again when the cold returns. Your kind makes this difficult. The ice retreats too soon, returns too late. I wake hungry in a changing world. As it spoke without speaking, its body began to react to the room's increasing heat. Steam rose from its surface, and parts of its translucent skin appeared to ripple and distort. You think to harm me with heat, with salt. The small ones in green coverings tried this before. I learned from them, adapted. It took a step toward me, claws leaving deep gouges in the metal floor. The temperature around it dropped precipitously, ice forming and spreading outward from each footprint despite the boiler's roaring heat. I grabbed the bucket of salt water and hurled it with all my strength. The liquid splashed across its chest and face, causing an immediate and violent reaction. The creature reeled backward, emitting a high-pitched keening that threatened to shatter my eardrums. Portions of its body where the salt water had made contact began to dissolve, melting into puddles on the floor. Pain. This is pain! Its mental voice hammered into my consciousness with such force that my vision blurred. I used the moment of distraction to dart behind the boiler, where I'd stashed a second bucket of even more concentrated salt solution. The creature recovered quickly, its damaged tissue already beginning to reform as it lunged toward me with frightening speed. I dodged sideways, feeling the rush of air as claws passed inches from my face. The close proximity to its body was like standing inside a freezer. My eyelashes immediately frosted over, and my skin burned with flash freeze. The boiler's pressure gauge had entered the red zone, the needle vibrating against the pin. Steam escaped from every joint and seam, filling the room with scalding vapor that seemed to hurt the creature but didn't stop it. It cornered me against the far wall, its massive form blocking any escape route. Those ancient eyes studied me with cold calculation. No more malice than a scientist might show a laboratory specimen. Your species is so fragile, so brief. We were here before you crawled from the oceans. We will remain when you are gone. In that moment, I realized I was likely looking at the last face I would ever see. Not the faces of my son and ex-husband that had haunted my dreams for 3 years, but this ancient predator from a world before humanity. The boiler gave a final, protesting groan as pressure exceeded its structural limits. Metal screamed against metal as rivets began to pop free like bullets. I knew what would happen next. You've been asleep too long, I told the creature, a strange calm settling over me. You don't understand what humans are capable of. I hurled the second bucket of salt water directly at the creature's face, simultaneously diving behind the massive boiler, just as it exploded with catastrophic force. The blast was deafening, a physical wall of sound and heat that slammed me against the concrete floor with bone-breaking force. Superheated steam and shrapnel filled the room, the temperature instantly soaring beyond anything the creature could withstand. Its scream, both audible and mental, was like nothing I've ever experienced. It penetrated to the core of my being, a primal sound of rage and agony from something that had never known defeat. Through the billowing steam, I glimpsed the creature thrashing wildly, its body literally coming apart as heat and salt disrupted whatever impossible biology sustained it. Chunks of its flesh dissolved into puddles on the floor, while others sublimated directly into vapor. It lunged toward me one final time, claws extended before collapsing to its knees. In its last moments, its mental voice touched mine once more. Fainter, fragmenting. Others sleep beneath the ice. Many others. They will wake as the warmth grows. They will remember you. Then it was gone, dissolved into a puddle of iridescent liquid that rapidly evaporated in the extreme heat, leaving behind only a faint trace of frost on the floor. I don't remember much of what followed. The explosion had ruptured steam pipes throughout the station, filling every room with scalding vapor. I suffered second-degree burns across my back and arms, 3 broken ribs, and a concussion from being thrown against the wall. Somehow, I managed to shut down the remaining fuel lines to prevent fire from consuming what remained of the station. Then I dragged myself to the communication room and activated the emergency beacon, a last resort signal that would bring immediate evacuation response regardless of weather conditions. The station was eerily quiet after the battle. The creature's remains had evaporated completely, leaving no physical evidence of its existence. Marcus's body lay in the hallway where he had fallen, his face frozen in that last expression of terror. I couldn't stop replaying his final words in my head. It's here. He had come to warn me, and it had cost him his life. Jack Ryder was still alive, barely. The rescue team reached him the next morning, evacuating him from his crashed helicopter. His injuries were severe. Frostbite had claimed most of his fingers, and he suffered extreme hypothermia. According to the medical reports, he couldn't stop mumbling about ice that moves and eyes in the storm. He would never fly again. Enyu had vanished completely. I searched for him after the rescue team arrived, but there was no trace of him anywhere. It was as if the storm, or something within it, had swallowed him whole. I hoped he had somehow made it to safety, but deep in my heart, I feared the worst. The Park Service arrived 3 days later to investigate what they termed a catastrophic equipment failure. I told them everything. The creature, the tracks, Marcus's death, the ancient remains in the ice cave. They documented my statement with professional courtesy and obvious disbelief. The official report listed Marcus's death as an accident caused by exposure to extreme weather conditions and Jack's injuries as results of the helicopter crash. The station's destruction was attributed to boiler malfunction due to improper maintenance. No mention was made of the creature or the strange phenomena I documented. No explanation was offered for the unusual ice formations or the complete absence of wildlife. Science has no category for Tornet or frostwalkers. Before they left, I showed the investigators something I'd found near the glacier edge 2 days after the battle. Tiny embryonic ice formations scattered across the valley floor like seeds waiting for spring. They looked harmless at first glance, just unusual crystalline structures emerging from the melting permafrost. But when I examined them under my portable microscope, I saw something chilling, microscopic cellular structures identical to those I'd observed in samples taken from the creature. They were dormant now, but alive in some fundamental sense, waiting for the right conditions to develop. It wasn't over. The warming temperatures were waking more of them. The first had been an outlier, a solitary scout awoken prematurely by an unusually early thaw. But others would follow as the climate continued its inexorable warming trend. The rescue team ordered me to evacuate immediately. I refused. Someone needs to monitor this, I told them. Someone who knows what to look for. They thought I was suffering from trauma and isolation, that my experiences were delusions born of grief and extreme conditions. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I imagined everything. The creature, its mental voice, the impossible biological structures under my microscope. But I don't think so. As the rescue team drove away, I stood alone on the edge of the glacier, staring out at the vast expanse of white. The wind carried with it a faint echo of something primal and ancient. A world before humans. A time when creatures like the Tornet ruled a planet locked in ice. My son and ex-husband died because I wasn't there when they needed me. Marcus died because I was too stubborn to leave when I should have. I won't make the same mistake again. The thaw continues. The ice retreats a little more each year, and beneath it they wait, patient predators from a forgotten age, stirring in their frozen sleep as warmth penetrates their ancient sanctuary. I've established a new research station 2 miles south of the original site. On paper, I'm conducting climate studies and tracking glacial retreat patterns. In reality, I'm watching for signs, unusual ice formations, unexplained cold spots, the unnatural silence that precedes their awakening. I've prepared this time. Heat weapons, salt-based chemical compounds, early warning systems. I don't know if it will be enough when they rise in numbers, but I'll be ready to fight. Because I've learned something the Tornet don't yet understand. Humans are predators too. We've survived ice ages, mega eruptions, and our own destructive tendencies. We adapt, we learn, we remember, and I remember everything. The call came in just before dawn, though I hadn't slept a wink. Night shifts in small-town Pennsylvania didn't usually mean much beyond drunks and the occasional domestic dispute, but something felt off about this one. A farmer named Joel Rentoul, a decent enough guy who lived on the outskirts, called in to report his livestock had been slaughtered. That didn't sound too out of the ordinary. Coyotes were known to pick off a few sheep every now and then, but Joel was frantic, said the scene looked like a massacre, not an animal attack. I'm Finn Walters, and I've been a cop in this town for close to 20 years. I've seen just about everything. Accidents, petty thefts, the rare meth lab bust. But nothing ever prepared me for what I found at Rentoul's farm that morning. The roads were quiet, lined with oaks that cast long shadows in the early light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and as I pulled up to the farm, I noticed the old windmill creaking lazily in the breeze. Rentoul was standing by the barn, his face pale and eyes wide. He was a big man, but today he looked smaller somehow. "They're all dead," he said as I stepped out of the patrol car. "Every last one." I nodded, more out of habit than anything. "Show me." He led me around the back of the barn to the pasture. I'd seen dead animals before, sure, but this was something else. The sheep were strewn across the field, bodies torn apart as if some beast had played with them before deciding they weren't worth the trouble. Blood soaked the earth, painting it a dark, muddy brown. I crouched down beside one of the carcasses, my fingers brushing against the ragged edges of what used to be a neck. "No coyote did this," I muttered. "Damn right it didn't," Joel replied. "I don't know what kind of creature it was, but it was no coyote. Did you hear anything last night?" Joel shook his head. "Nothing unusual. But the dogs, they were barking like mad. Then, just before dawn, it all went quiet. That's when I found them." I stood surveying the field. Whatever did this had strength, and a lot of it. The question was, what kind of animal could rip through a whole flock of sheep like this? I'd heard stories about mountain lions making their way down into the farmlands, but there were no signs of that here. No tracks, no scat, nothing. As I continued to inspect the scene, something caught my eye. About 50 yards away, near the tree line, there was a disturbance in the grass. I motioned for Joel to follow me as I walked over. The ground was uneven, like something heavy had been dragged across it. "Stay back," I told Joel as I unholstered my sidearm and moved closer to the trees. My pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. Not at all. Just as I stepped into the shade of the trees, the smell hit me. It was a stench so foul it turned my stomach. The thick, cloying odor of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I followed the scent deeper into the woods, stepping over broken branches and matted grass until I found it. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was just a mound of flesh and bone, mangled beyond recognition. But as I leaned in closer, my heart skipped a beat. The remains weren't animal. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root as the realization set in. The body was human, or what was left of it. The face was unrecognizable, the skin torn and shredded, but the clothes, a tattered plaid shirt and jeans, were unmistakable. I'd seen that shirt before. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "It's Jimmy Harper." Jimmy was a local handyman, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. He'd been missing for a week, but no one thought much of it. People come and go in small towns, but this was no ordinary disappearance. Something had done this to him. Something with an appetite far beyond the usual predators. I called it in, and within an hour, the place was swarming with state police and investigators. They cordoned off the area, took photos, collected samples, but nobody had any answers. The only thing we knew for certain was that Jimmy hadn't been killed here. He'd been dragged from somewhere else, and whatever had done it didn't care who or what got in its way. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Lowell, a transplant from Pittsburgh who never quite adjusted to our small-town pace, looked grim as she examined what remained of Jimmy. "These wounds," she said, pointing to the ragged edges of flesh. "They're not consistent with any predator I've ever seen. The tearing pattern is all wrong. What are you saying, Doc?" I asked, dreading the answer. She looked up at me, her eyes cold and clinical. "I'm saying whatever did this wasn't just hungry, Finn. It was deliberate." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the morning sun now beating down on the field. "Deliberate how?" "The way the body is torn apart. It's methodical. Some parts were clearly sampled." She swallowed hard. "And look at these marks here." She pointed to a series of deep gouges in what remained of Jimmy's chest cavity. "Those aren't teeth marks. They look more like fingers, long, sharp fingers." The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and sleepless nights. Rumors spread like wildfire, talk of wild animals, escaped convicts, even supernatural creatures. But I knew better. There was something out there, something real and dangerous. The town was on edge, and it was my job to keep them safe. But I didn't know how. Chief Morgan, a man whose permanent scowl seemed etched into his leathery face, called me into his office 3 days after we found Jimmy. "This is bad business, Walters," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "Real bad. People are scared." "I know, Chief. We're doing everything we can." He finally looked up, his pale blue eyes piercing. "Are we? Because all I'm seeing is a whole lot of nothing. No suspects, no leads, just a bunch of scared folks and dead animals." "And Jimmy," I reminded him. "And Jimmy," he agreed, his voice softening slightly. "What do you make of it?" I hesitated. What could I say? That I believed something not quite natural was stalking our town? That would earn me a one-way ticket to psychiatric evaluation. "I think we're dealing with something dangerous," I said carefully. "Something that's not going to stop with Jimmy." The chief nodded slowly. "That's what I'm afraid of. Keep your eyes open, Walters, and your gun loaded." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jimmy's mangled body and those strange marks Dr. Lowell had pointed out. Long, sharp fingers. What kind of creature had fingers like that? I decided to drive around town, partly to patrol, partly to clear my head. The streets were deserted, most folks wisely choosing to stay indoors after dark. As I drove past the old cemetery on Hill Road, my headlights caught something moving among the gravestones. I slowed the car, squinting through the windshield. It could have been a deer. We get them wandering through town sometimes. But the movement didn't seem right. Too low to the ground, too deliberate. I pulled over, killed the engine, and grabbed my flashlight. Standard procedure would be to call for backup. But what would I say? I saw something moving in the cemetery. I'd be the laughingstock of the department. The air was cool and still as I pushed open the wrought iron gate. It creaked on its hinges, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating weathered headstones and overgrown patches of grass. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. "Police officer. Anyone there?" The only response was the distant hoot of an owl. I moved deeper into the cemetery, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Most of these graves were old, dating back to the town's founding in the 1800s. The newer section was on the far side, beyond a small copse of elm trees. As I approached the trees, that smell returned, the same fetid stench I'd encountered at Rentoul's farm. My hand moved instinctively to my sidearm as I swept the flashlight beam across the ground. The earth was disturbed in front of one of the older graves, the soil freshly turned as if something had been digging. But it wasn't like any animal burrow I'd ever seen. The hole was large, almost 4 feet in diameter, and it went straight down, disappearing into blackness. I crouched beside it, shining my light into the depths. The beam couldn't reach the bottom. It was just an endless void, as if the earth itself had opened up to reveal something beneath, something that had been there all along, waiting. And then I heard it, a soft, wet sound coming from the darkness below, like something moving through thick mud. And beneath that, a rhythmic scraping, claws on stone, or long, sharp fingers. I backed away from the hole, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was down there, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't alone. Then, 3 nights after finding Jimmy, it happened again. I was on patrol, driving down the old logging road that cut through the woods. It was late, and the moonlight barely pierced the canopy of trees. I hadn't seen another car for miles when the radio crackled to life. Unit 27, we've got a report of screams coming from the Miller place. Neighbors called it in. Can you respond? I grabbed the radio. 10-4, I'm close by. I'll check it out. The Miller place was an old farmhouse at the edge of town, long abandoned after old man Miller passed away. Kids would dare each other to go there, but nobody actually did. It was just one of those places with a reputation. A bad one. What neighbors had called in the screams? The nearest house was a quarter-mile away. The isolation of the place suddenly felt oppressive as I pulled up the overgrown driveway, my headlights catching the peeling paint and broken windows of the farmhouse. When I arrived, the house was dark, the windows broken and the door hanging off its hinges. I drew my gun and approached cautiously. There was no sound, no movement, just the creak of the floorboards as I stepped inside. "Police," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" No answer, just silence. I moved through the house, clearing each room as I went. It was the same as I remembered, dusty, empty, lifeless. But as I reached the basement door, I heard it, a low, guttural noise coming from below. "Who's there?" I demanded, but again, no response. I pushed open the door, gun raised as I descended the creaky steps. The air grew colder with each step and the smell returned. Rotten, putrid death. When I reached the bottom, my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the source of the smell. In the center of the basement, there was a hole, deep, wide, and lined with dirt. The edges were clawed and raw, as if something had burrowed its way up from the ground. And lying at the bottom of the hole, covered in blood and dirt, was the body of a woman, Marcy Lawson, another missing local. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before something moved in the darkness. A shadow, large and hunched, skittered across the far wall. My flashlight caught it just for a second, a glimpse of matted fur, long limbs, and teeth. I fired, but the thing moved too fast. It lunged at me, knocking me to the ground, and I felt claws digging into my side. I kicked and scrambled to my feet, but it was gone, retreating back into the shadows, into the earth. I called for backup, and they found me there, bloody and shaken, with the bodies of Marcy and 2 others finally uncovered. The town was shaken, but the officials had their explanation, some kind of deranged animal. They organized a hunt, set up traps, but nothing was ever caught. But I knew. It wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't gone. Whatever it was still out there, somewhere in the dark places where no one dares to go. Dr. Lowell stitched up my side at the clinic, her hands steady despite the late hour. "You're lucky," she said, tying off the last suture. "Whatever got you missed anything vital. But these wounds, what about them?" I asked, wincing as she applied antiseptic. "They're similar to what I saw in Jimmy and Marcy. Long, parallel lacerations, like claws but with a deliberate pattern." She looked up at me, her face grim. "Finn, what exactly did you see down there?" I hesitated. How could I describe something I'd only caught a glimpse of? A shadow with teeth? A nightmare made flesh? "It was fast," I said finally. "Big but fast. Hunched over. And the teeth." I trailed off, remembering the flash of yellowed fangs in the beam of my flashlight. They weren't like anything I've ever seen before. Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "The bodies, they're showing signs of consumption. Specific organs removed. It's like whatever is doing this is feeding, selectively." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of animal does that?" "That's just it, Finn. I don't think we're dealing with an animal. Not in the conventional sense." The next morning, the town council called an emergency meeting. The high school gymnasium was packed, every chair filled with more people standing along the walls. The fear was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Mayor Wilson, a short man with a perpetual nervous smile, stood at the podium looking anything but happy. Chief Morgan stood beside him, arms crossed, face set in its usual scowl. "Now, folks," the mayor began, his voice wavering slightly, "I know there's been a lot of talk going around about what happened at the Miller place. I want to assure you that the situation is under control." A murmur ran through the crowd. No one believed him. "We've brought in experts from the state wildlife department," he continued. "They believe we're dealing with a rogue mountain lion or possibly a bear that's developed a taste for livestock. They've set traps throughout the woods, and we've issued a curfew for everyone's safety." "What about Jimmy and Marcy?" someone called from the back. "Did a mountain lion drag them into that basement too?" The mayor's smile faltered. "Now, we don't know all the details yet, Bullshit! The voice came from Joel Rental, who had pushed his way to the front. I saw what it did to my sheep. No mountain lion does that. No bear either. And it sure as hell doesn't dig holes and hide bodies. The crowd grew louder, voices overlapping as fear turned to anger. I stood at the back, watching it all unfold, my side throbbing beneath my bandages. Chief Morgan stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. All right, that's enough. We understand you're scared. Hell, we all are. But panic isn't going to help anyone. He gestured to me. Officer Walters here encountered whatever is responsible for these attacks. He's been tracking it, and with the help of the wildlife experts, we will find it and put it down. In the meantime, I need everyone to stay calm, stay indoors after dark, and report anything suspicious immediately. All eyes turned to me, and I felt a weight settle on my shoulders. I hadn't been tracking anything. I'd stumbled onto it by chance, and it had nearly killed me. But looking at those frightened faces, I knew they needed something to believe in, someone to trust. We're doing everything we can, I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. Just stay safe and let us handle this. After the meeting, as people filed out of the gymnasium, Mrs. Harper, Jimmy's mother, approached me. She was a small woman, bent with age and grief, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Officer Walters, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't tell me what happened to my Jimmy, not really. But you were there. You saw, I swallowed hard. How could I tell her what had become of her son? How could I describe the mangled remains I'd found in those woods? Mrs. Harper, please, she cut me off. I need to know. Was it quick? The mercy of a lie seemed the only kindness I could offer. Yes, ma'am. It was very quick. He wouldn't have suffered. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, and will you find what did this? Will you make it pay? I looked into those tearful eyes and made a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. Yes, ma'am. I will. That night I sat at my kitchen table, maps spread out before me. The attacks so far had been concentrated in the northern part of the county. Rental's farm, the Miller place, and the old cemetery where I'd found the hole. There was a pattern here, but I couldn't see it yet. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Sarah Lowell. Finn, I've been looking at soil samples from the hole at the Miller place, she said without preamble. There's something strange about them. Strange how? I asked, reaching for a pen. The composition isn't right. There are trace elements that shouldn't be there, at least not in those concentrations. And there's something else, organic material embedded in the soil. Old, very old. What kind of organic material? That's just it, I'm not sure. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. The cellular structure is wrong. I've sent samples to a colleague at the university, but it could be days before we hear back. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. We might not have days, Sarah. I know. She paused, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Finn, have you ever heard of the hollow earth theory? Can't say that I have. It's an old idea, mostly discredited now. The belief that there are vast caverns beneath the earth's surface, possibly inhabited by things, creatures that have evolved separately from the surface world. I almost laughed, but the image of that hole in the Miller Place basement flashed in my mind. You're not seriously suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, she cut me off. I'm just saying that there are old stories, legends really, about things that come up from below. And looking at these soil samples, at the remains we've found, I'm starting to wonder if there might be some truth to them. After we hung up, I couldn't shake her words. Stories about things that come up from below. It sounded ridiculous, like something from a pulp horror novel. But then again, what had I seen in that basement? What had clawed its way out of the earth and started hunting in our town? I pulled out an old book from my shelf, a local history that had belonged to my grandfather. He'd been a police officer too, back in the 40s and 50s. The book was full of notes in his cramped handwriting, little observations about cases he'd worked, people he'd known. And there, in the margin next to a chapter about the town's founding, was a single word that made my blood run cold. Diggers. My grandfather's notes were sparse but disturbing. According to him, there had been similar incidents in the 1950s. Livestock mutilations, disappearances, strange holes found in the earth. The old-timers had called the culprits diggers, though no one would speak of them directly. They were considered bad luck, a taboo subject. The attacks had stopped as suddenly as they began, and life in town returned to normal. But my grandfather had remained vigilant, keeping notes, recording patterns. He believed the diggers, whatever they were, operated in cycles, emerging every few decades to feed before retreating back beneath the earth. If he was right, they were right on schedule. I spent the next day in the county archives, digging through old newspapers and police reports. And there it was, a pattern repeated through history. 1898, 1952, and now 2025. Each time, the same signs. Mutilated livestock, missing persons, strange holes appearing in the earth. But in 1952, there had been something else, a name. Martin Thorne, a local hunter who had claimed to kill one of the creatures. He'd described it as neither man nor beast, but something in between. A thing of claws and hunger that walked on two legs but moved on all fours. Thorne had become a local hero for a time, celebrated for ending the killings. But according to later reports, he'd grown paranoid, insisting that there were more of the creatures, that they were watching him, waiting. He'd been found dead in his cabin 6 months later, his body badly decomposed but with clear signs of the same distinctive wounds seen on the other victims. The diggers had taken their revenge. As I drove home that evening, the sun sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods that lined the road seemed darker somehow, deeper, as if they concealed secrets that had been hidden for generations. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the gravel shoulder. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear standing on its hind legs. But as I peered through the gathering darkness, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs, but hunched forward, its arms too long, hanging past what should have been knees. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a mottled gray-brown like the color of the earth after a heavy rain. And its face. I couldn't make out details in the fading light, but I could see eyes reflecting my headlights, glowing like embers in the dark. I reached for my gun, but before I could even draw it, the thing was gone, melting back into the trees with a fluid grace that belied its awkward appearance. My hands were shaking as I put the car back in drive. It had seen me. And worse, it had wanted me to see it. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a message. The diggers knew I was looking for them. When I got home, I found Sarah Lowell waiting on my porch, a thick folder clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "I've heard back from my colleague," she said, as soon as I stepped out of the car. "The samples I sent him, Finn, they're not like anything on record. The DNA is, I don't even know how to describe it. Alien, but not extraterrestrial. More like divergent. As if it branched off from the evolutionary tree millions of years ago and developed in isolation." I ushered her inside, locking the door behind us. "I think I saw one of them tonight," I said, pouring us both a stiff drink. "On the road at the edge of the woods." Sarah's hand trembled as she took the glass. "What did it look like?" I described the figure as best I could, the unnatural proportions, the strange fluid movement. "That matches the samples." She nodded. "A creature adapted for life underground. The long arms for digging. The mottled skin to blend with the earth. But that doesn't explain the intelligence, the deliberate nature of the attacks. Maybe they're more than just animals," I suggested, thinking of my grandfather's notes. "Maybe there's something else entirely." "Like what?" "I don't know. But whatever they are, they've been here a long time. Longer than us. And they see this place as their territory." As if to punctuate my words, a long, mournful howl echoed from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard. Not a wolf, not a coyote, but something deeper, more resonant. A sound that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards rather than travel through the air. Sarah's face went even paler. "That's not normal." "No," I agreed, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. "It's not. What do we do?" she asked, her voice small in the quiet house. I thought of Martin Thorne, the hunter who'd killed one of the diggers only to fall victim to their revenge. I thought of Mrs. Harper, asking me to make her son's killers pay. I thought of the hole in the Miller Place basement leading down into darkness. "We find where they're coming from," I said finally, "and we seal it off." The next morning I met with Chief Morgan and explained my theory. To his credit, he listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each detail. "This is insane, Walters," he said when I finished. "Underground monsters? Ancient creatures attacking our town? Do you know how this sounds? I know exactly how it sounds, Chief, but it's the only explanation that fits all the evidence. These aren't normal animal attacks. These aren't normal disappearances. Something is hunting in our town, something that knows what it's doing. He sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. Even if I believed you, and I'm not saying I do, what exactly are you proposing? That we go hunting for these diggers? No, I think that would be suicide. But we need to find where they're coming from and seal it off. The holes, the tunnels, they all have to lead somewhere. If we can find the main entrance and collapse it, maybe we can trap them underground. And how do you suggest we find this entrance? I spread out a map of the town and surrounding areas. The attacks have all been concentrated here, in the northern part of the county. If we overlay this with geological survey maps, look for cave systems, old mines, anything that might provide access to whatever's below. Chief Morgan studied the map, his frown deepening. The old quarry, he said finally, pointing to a spot just beyond the town limits. It was abandoned in the 70s. Deep pit, lots of tunnels from the mining operations. Perfect spot for something to hide, I agreed, or to use as an entrance to something deeper. I'll gather a team, the chief said, standing up. But Walters, this stays between us for now. No talk of underground monsters or ancient creatures. As far as anyone else is concerned, we're looking for a wild animal that's made its den in the quarry. Understood? Understood, Chief. As I turned to leave, he called after me. And Walters, be careful. If you're right about these things, they won't go quietly. That afternoon, a team of 6 officers, including myself, Chief Morgan, and 2 state wildlife experts, headed out to the old quarry. The place was a gaping wound in the earth, a pit nearly 100 feet deep with sheer walls of exposed rock. At the bottom, partially filled with stagnant water, were the entrances to several mine shafts that had been sealed off when the quarry was abandoned. Or at least, they were supposed to have been sealed off. As we made our way down the steep path to the quarry floor, I noticed that one of the mine entrances had been cleared. The concrete barrier that should have blocked it was broken, chunks of it scattered across the ground as if something had smashed through from the inside. Chief, I called, pointing to the broken barrier. Look at that. Chief Morgan's face hardened. Everyone stay alert. We don't know what we're dealing with here. We approached the mine entrance cautiously, weapons drawn. The opening was a black maw in the quarry wall, exhaling a cold, damp breath that carried with it that now familiar stench. Decay and something else. Something ancient and wrong. One of the wildlife experts, a young woman named Martinez, pulled out a device that looked like a radar gun. I'm picking up heat signatures inside, she said, her voice tight with tension. Multiple signatures moving. How many? Chief Morgan asked. Martinez shook her head. Hard to say. The readings are jumbled, but more than 3, less than 10, I'd guess. All right, the chief said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We go in, we confirm what we're dealing with, and we get out. Then we call in reinforcements and proper equipment to seal this place up. No heroics, understand? We all nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. These creatures, these diggers, had been hunting in our town for weeks. They were intelligent, methodical, and they knew we were looking for them. Walking into their den felt like walking into a trap, but there was no other way to confirm what we were dealing with. No other way to end the killings. We switched on our flashlights and stepped into the darkness of the mine shaft. The air grew colder with each step, the stench stronger. The walls were rough-hewn, supported by rotting timber beams that creaked ominously above our heads. After about 50 yards, the shaft opened into a larger chamber, what must have been a central hub for the mining operation. But what we saw there wasn't the remains of human industry. The chamber had been transformed. The walls were covered in a strange, glistening substance that pulsed faintly in the beam of our flashlights. The floor was littered with bones, animal and human, arranged in bizarre, almost ritualistic patterns. And at the center of it all, a pit deeper than our lights could penetrate, from which emanated that fetid, ancient smell. Jesus Christ, one of the officers whispered. What is this place? Before anyone could answer, a sound came from the darkness beyond our light, a wet, slithering noise, followed by that same guttural growl I'd heard in the Miller Place basement. We need to leave, I said, backing toward the entrance. Now, but it was too late. Shadows moved at the edges of our light, circling, watching. I caught glimpses of them. Long limbs, mottled skin, eyes reflecting our flashlights like burning coals. The diggers had been waiting for us, Chief Morgan raised his weapon. Stand your ground. Don't let them surround us. The first attack came from the right, a blur of movement as one of the creatures lunged from the shadows. Officer Reynolds went down with a scream, the thing on top of him, those long, sharp fingers tearing through his vest like it was paper. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the chamber in stark strobing bursts. I caught clearer glimpses of our attackers now, humanoid but wrong, their bodies twisted and elongated, their faces a nightmare of too many teeth and too few features. They moved with unnatural speed, scuttling across the walls and ceiling like insects. Fall back, Chief Morgan shouted over the chaos. To the entrance! We retreated, firing as we went, dragging the wounded Reynolds with us. The creatures pursued, howling that bone-chilling cry that seemed to vibrate through the very rock around us. I was at the rear, covering our retreat when I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, as if all the warmth had been sucked from the air. And then from the pit at the center of the chamber, something else began to emerge. It was larger than the others, its skin not the mottled brown of earth, but a pale, sickly white like something that had never seen the sun. Its limbs were longer, more articulated, and its face, what I could see of it in the chaos of the retreating flashlight beams, was almost human, but stretched and distorted, as if viewed through warped glass. This wasn't just a digger. This was something else. Something older. Run! I shouted, firing at the pale creature as it pulled itself from the pit. My bullets seemed to have no effect, simply disappearing into its flesh without leaving a mark. We fled back up the mine shaft, the howls of the diggers echoing behind us. Reynolds was unconscious now, blood seeping through his makeshift bandages. Martinez, the wildlife expert, was limping badly, her leg torn open by one of the creature's claws. Somehow we made it back to the quarry entrance, stumbling into the fading daylight. But as we reached the safety of our vehicles, I looked back at the mine entrance and saw it, the pale creature, standing just inside the shadow of the mine shaft, watching us with eyes that glinted like polished obsidian. It raised one long, white hand in what almost seemed like a gesture of farewell, or perhaps a promise. We would meet again. The official report was filed. The bodies were buried, and the town moved on, though none of us would ever really forget. But life continues, and the night patrol goes on. There's no room for fear, no room for hesitation, just the job. And so when the wind howls through the trees, when the night is darker than it should be, I drive those old roads watchful and ready, because there's always something waiting just beyond the light. That's what I tell myself anyway. That's the lie I live with. The truth is, we never went back to that quarry. Chief Morgan suffered a heart attack 3 days after our encounter, and the new leadership wasn't interested in pursuing what they saw as a wild goose chase. The attack stopped, at least for a while, and that was enough for them. Case closed. Move on. Reynolds died from his injuries. Martinez recovered physically but transferred out of the department soon after. The others who had been with us that day never spoke of what we saw in that mine shaft. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend it had been some kind of animal, a bear maybe, or a pack of feral dogs driven mad by disease. But I knew better. I'd seen the pale thing in the pit. I'd felt its cold intelligence assessing us, measuring us, and sometimes in the dead of night I swear I can feel it still, watching from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Sarah Lowell continues her research in secret. She's mapped the soil anomalies throughout the county, tracked the subtle changes in local wildlife behavior. According to her, the diggers haven't left. They've just gone deeper, biding their time. They're expanding, she told me over coffee last week, her voice low despite the nearly empty diner. The tunnel system. It's growing. How can you be sure? I asked, though I already believed her. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were satellite images, ground-penetrating radar scans, geological survey maps. All showed the same thing, a network of tunnels spreading outward from the quarry like the roots of some monstrous tree. They're preparing for something, she said. Something big. I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. The cycles my grandfather had noted, the patterns in the historical records, they all pointed to the same conclusion. What we had experienced was just the beginning, a small taste of hunger before the feast. Last night I dreamt of the pale creature again. In the dream I was back in that chamber beneath the quarry, but alone this time. The creature sat on a throne of bones, its long white fingers drumming against the skull that formed the armrest. It spoke to me in a voice like stones grinding together, a language I shouldn't have understood but somehow did. "Your kind has forgotten," it said, "but we remember. We have always remembered." I woke drenched in sweat, the echo of its voice still ringing in my ears. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that might have been distant crying or laughter. Today I visited Mrs. Harper. She's failing now, her grief having hollowed her out from the inside. But there was something else in her eyes when she looked at me. A knowledge, a resignation. "They're coming back, aren't they?" she asked as I sat beside her bed. "The things that took my Jimmy." I couldn't lie to her. "Not anymore." "Yes, ma'am, I think they are." She nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about things that lived in the dark places, things that would come up and take people back down with them." I never believed her. She looked out the window, where the first snowflakes of winter were beginning to fall. I should have listened. "Mrs. Harper, what exactly did your grandmother say about these things?" "She said they were old, older than people, that they lived here long before us and would be here long after we're gone." She turned back to me, her eyes suddenly clear and sharp. She said, "They feed on more than just flesh, Officer Walters. They feed on fear, on despair, on the knowing that you can't escape them." As I left her house, the snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the town in a deceptive purity. But beneath that pristine whiteness, I knew the earth was stirring. The diggers were awake and hungry and preparing, and somewhere, in the deepest darkness beneath our feet, the pale creature waited, patient as only something ancient can be. I've started keeping my own notes now, just like my grandfather did. Recording patterns, documenting sightings, preparing for what I know is coming. Because the cycle isn't over. It's just beginning. Tonight, as I patrol the quiet streets of our town, I'll keep my eyes on the shadows and my ears tuned to the sounds beneath the normal. The soft scraping of claws on stone. The whisper of something moving through earth. The low, mournful howl that vibrates not through air but through soil and rock and bone. And when they come again, as I know they will, I'll be ready. Not to fight them, not to stop them. No one can do that. But to survive them. To document them. To leave a record for those who come after. So that next time perhaps someone will believe. Because there's always something waiting just beyond the light. Something ancient and patient and hungry. Something that remembers what we have forgotten. The diggers. The pale creature. The things beneath the soil, they are coming. And all we can do is watch and wait and dread the moment when the earth begins to move. The forest speaks in many tongues. The rustle of leaves, the murmur of streams, the calls of creatures unseen. As a senior ranger for the Hiawatha National Forest Service, I've learned to interpret these voices. But there are sounds that have no translation, utterances from something that doesn't belong in these woods. This is my account of what happened in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the autumn of 1997, a record I've kept hidden until now. I always thought being a park ranger in a place like Michigan's Upper Peninsula was going to be easy. Wide open forests, freshwater lakes as far as the eye could see, and the isolation of the wilderness were exactly what I wanted. I never imagined that isolation could take on a darker meaning. The year was 1997. My name is Ron Whitman. Before I landed this job, I had worked a desk for 5 years in a dull insurance office in Chicago. That was enough to make anyone crave fresh air and solitude. Moving up here felt like a permanent vacation at first. I'd grown up fishing with my dad on Lake Superior, so it seemed like a dream come true. Trading paperwork for trail maintenance and visitor questions about where to spot bald eagles. My first 6 months passed like a dream. Spring thawed into summer, bringing waves of tourists eager to experience the untamed beauty of the peninsula. I spent my days marking trails, explaining local wildlife to wide-eyed city folks, and occasionally rescuing the odd unprepared hiker. Nights were spent in my cabin on the edge of the Forest Service property, windows open to the symphony of cicadas and distant loon calls. By August, I had mapped sections of the wilderness that hadn't been properly surveyed in decades. My supervisor, Carl Bergman, a leathery man with 30 years of ranger service behind him, had taken a liking to me. "Whitman," he'd say, slapping my shoulder with calloused hands, "you're taking to this life like you were born for it." I was. The solitude that drove others mad after weeks in the backcountry was a balm to me. The forest became an extension of myself. I could sense changes in weather by the way pine needles shifted, Could tell which animals had passed by reading subtle signs most would overlook. The locals accepted me gradually, as they did with any outsider who proved they weren't just passing through. I'd join them at Marge's Tavern in the nearby town of Whitefish Harbor on my days off, listening to tales of strange lights over the lake and century-old logging accidents that still haunted these woods. The peninsula keeps its secrets. Old Jim Redpath told me one evening over his third whiskey. Been here since before the first white man set foot, and they'll be here long after we're gone. I remember laughing, thinking he was just spinning yarns for the new ranger. Folklore was rich up here. Stories of Wendigos and phantom ships on Superior, the kind of tales that made tourist campfires more exciting. Late August brought a series of unusual reports. 3 separate hiking groups reported hearing unnatural sounds near the eastern trails. Carl dismissed it as elk or maybe a territorial black bear. Standard procedure was to post notices at trailheads and check the areas for signs of aggressive wildlife. Then came Labor Day weekend, our last major tourist influx before the season wound down. A family of 4 from Wisconsin claimed their campsite had been surrounded by something during the night. Nothing was seen, but their children were hysterical and they packed up at dawn. Something was circling us, the father insisted, his face ashen despite the summer tan, not walking. Not like an animal. It was deliberate. The following week, a backpacker named Daniel Schreiber failed to check in after a planned 3-day solo hike. Search and rescue found his campsite intact. Food hanging properly from trees, tent set up correctly, even his journal open to his last entry. The final words written were, "Third night. The sounds are back. Closer this time. Not animal. Need to investigate." His boots were still there. His backpack. Everything except Daniel himself. I was part of the search team. We combed that area for 8 days before weather forced us to scale back. The official report listed him as missing, presumed injured or disoriented. But there was something unspoken among the rangers. The tracks we found didn't match any known wildlife. Deep impressions that seemed to appear and disappear at random, as if whatever made them could step in and out of our world at will. By mid-September, the tourists had thinned to weekenders and retirees in RVs. The forest took on a different quality then, colors beginning to turn, a certain stillness in the air as if the wilderness was holding its breath before winter's plunge. Carl called me into his office on a Thursday morning. His usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by something more somber. "Ron, I need someone to check out the area around Dead Man's Creek," he said, unfolding a topographic map across his desk. "We've had more reports of strange noises, and some hunters found what they described as unusual markings on trees about 2 miles in." "Animal marks?" I asked. Carl hesitated. They said they were too precise, too high up, geometric almost. "Could be kids," I offered. "Plenty of locals know those woods." "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "Take the radio, document anything unusual, and be back before dark." As I prepared my gear that evening, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, like someone watching from just beyond the tree line. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the stories I'd heard and the disappearance of Daniel Schreiber. Little did I know that what waited for me in those woods would challenge everything I understood about nature, reality, and what truly lurks in places humans have only tentatively claimed. The trouble started in September, around the time tourists usually began thinning out. That part of the year, it's mostly locals who still camp or hike the remote areas of the woods. I was assigned to check on a couple of trails that had reports of people hearing strange noises. Now, it's not rare for animals to start making a bit of a racket as winter approaches. Elk, for example, can sound pretty eerie if you're not familiar with their bugle calls. I set out at dawn, my government-issue Ford Ranger cutting through the morning mist that clung to the forest floor like phantom fingers. The weather report promised clear skies, but up here Mother Nature made her own rules. A heavy pack sat beside me, extra layers, first aid kit, flares, water purification tablets, enough supplies to last 3 days, though I planned to be back by nightfall. The road to Dead Man's Creek was barely maintained, a relic from the logging days that the Forest Service kept open mainly for fire access. The name itself came from a century-old incident. A logger found face down in the water, his body apparently dragged there from miles away. Local legend claimed he'd encountered something in the deep woods, something the Ojibwe people refused to name. I parked at the trailhead and checked my watch, 6:48 a.m. Early light filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows that shifted with the gentle breeze. I'd dressed in layers, thermal underwear beneath regulation khaki pants and shirt, a fleece pullover tied around my waist. My boots were well worn, comfortable for the 10-mile loop I planned to hike. The day I went out, it was just me and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, doing a loop around a 10-mile trail near Dead Man's Creek. That area doesn't get much traffic, which was fine by me. I had a pair of binoculars strapped around my neck, a notebook, and my old beat-up radio that sometimes decided it was more for show than actual communication. I was alone out there, so I thought. The first mile passed uneventfully. The trail wound along ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the forest canopy, stretching like a multicolored ocean toward Lake Superior. Fall colors were just beginning their transformation, hints of gold among the green, splashes of crimson on the sugar maples. In another few weeks, these woods would be ablaze with autumn glory. I spotted typical wildlife, a red fox darting across the path, a pileated woodpecker hammering at a dead birch, evidence of beaver activity near a small tributary. Normal, peaceful. I jotted observations in my notebook, mostly about trail conditions and possible maintenance needs for the coming spring. At the 2-mile marker, I noticed the first oddity, a perfect circle of white mushrooms about 6 feet in diameter. Fairy rings weren't uncommon, but this one had a peculiar feature. Every mushroom within it was oriented in the same direction, as if pointing further along the trail. I photographed it more out of curiosity than concern. The morning warmed gradually, and I shed my outer layer as the sun climbed higher. By 10 o'clock, I'd covered nearly 4 miles, stopping occasionally to examine animal tracks or identify unusual plant growth. The forest had grown quieter the deeper I ventured, the typical background chorus of birds and insects fading to an unsettling silence. I tried calling into the station, a routine check-in, but got only static. No surprise. The ravines in this area created natural dead zones for radio signals. I'd try again higher up. Just before noon, I reached a small clearing where hikers often stopped for lunch. A fire ring of stones sat in the center, long cold, but something caught my eye. Claw marks on a nearby oak tree, not the usual bear scratches I was accustomed to seeing. These were deeper, more deliberate, and arranged in a pattern that looked almost like primitive symbols. I ran my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored without the oxidation that would come with age. Whatever made these marks had done so recently, perhaps within the last day or two. Continuing on, I noticed other subtle changes in the forest. Broken branches too high for deer to reach, small areas where the undergrowth had been crushed in circular patterns, as if something heavy had sat or nested there. Animal behavior had changed too. No squirrels chattering, no birds flitting through branches. I was halfway through my hike when I saw the first sign something was off. A shredded backpack hanging from a tree branch, too high for any normal animal to have placed it there. Black bears could climb, sure, but they don't exactly hang trophies. I called it in on the radio, hoping for a clear signal, but all I got was a wall of static. Great, I thought. The one day I could use this thing, it craps out. The backpack hung at least 15 feet up, suspended from a branch that would barely support my weight. It wasn't just torn. It was methodically shredded, each strip of fabric nearly identical in width, the contents removed. A student ID card lay on the ground beneath it. Daniel Schreiber, the missing hiker. My pulse quickened as I photographed everything, bagging the ID as evidence. The air had grown colder despite the midday sun, a penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I checked my map, calculating the fastest route back to my truck. But professional responsibility won out over growing unease. I needed to document everything I could for the search team. I kept walking, and then, maybe another mile down the trail, I saw something worse, pieces of fabric, torn clothes scattered along the ground like someone had run right out of them. I crouched down to examine them, holding my breath. The clothes weren't weathered, hadn't been out here long. It was as if someone had just been ripped out of them and disappeared without a trace. Maybe a bear did this, I thought. Bears, when they're hungry or feel threatened, can go after people. But there were no bear tracks, just odd, deep impressions in the dirt. Like something heavy but not human had passed through. The clothing was high-end outdoor gear. moisture-wicking shirts, thermal base layers, the kind of equipment serious hikers invested in. The tiers followed the same pattern as the backpack, methodical strips rather than random rips. And strangest of all, there was no blood, not even the smallest speck. I took out my notebook and jotted everything down. In my mind, I figured I'd call it in once I was back to the ranger station, but I kept walking forward because I'm an idiot who clearly doesn't know when to turn around. The trail narrowed as it descended toward Dead Man's Creek itself, the vegetation growing denser, less maintained. Old growth trees blocked much of the sunlight, creating a premature twilight beneath their massive boughs. The temperature dropped further, my breath now visible in small clouds. A faint odor began to permeate the air, something organic yet foreign. Not the usual forest decay, but something pungent and metallic, like corroded copper mixed with rotting meat. I pulled my bandana over my nose, but it did little to filter the stench. The creek appeared around the next bend, its waters running clear and swift over smooth stones. Under normal circumstances, it would have been picturesque. But as I approached, I noticed something in the water, flashes of white tumbling with the current. Bones, small ones, probably from deer or other forest creatures, but stripped completely clean and fractured in ways that spoke of tremendous force. I knelt by the stream's edge, using a stick to fish out one of the bone fragments. It was a deer femur, snapped cleanly in the middle with deep grooves etched along its length. Not the work of scavengers or natural decomposition. The noises started maybe 15 minutes later. At first it was a low, almost rhythmic thumping, like something huge was moving through the woods, stepping in time. I stopped in my tracks, my heart doing a little dance of its own, trying to listen closer. The sound stopped too. I laughed. Too much coffee, not enough breakfast probably. But then it started again, this time faster, and I swear it was following me. The rhythm matched no animal I knew, too measured for a loping bear, too heavy for anything else that should be in these woods. It paused when I paused, resumed when I moved, a deliberate mimicry that sent ice through my veins. I began to walk, then jog, realizing I was picking up the pace to match whatever it was. I know this sounds ridiculous, but the trees felt like they were closing in on me, branches brushing against my arms, pulling at my sleeves. The forest I'd known intimately for months suddenly felt alien, hostile. Shadows deepened where no shadows should be. The path ahead seemed to shift subtly. Landmarks I'd noted earlier appearing at odd angles or missing entirely. My ranger training told me to stay on the trail, but instinct screamed otherwise. I turned sharply off the trail, figuring if I could get some distance, I'd at least feel less like I was being hunted. What I found in that moment of desperate flight would forever change my understanding of the wilderness I thought I knew. What I stumbled upon next stopped me cold. The ground ahead of me was dark, not from shadow but from blood. It was pooled thickly in the underbrush, splattered up the trunks of trees. There were pieces of something, someone, I realized, stomach flipping, spread out in a way that didn't seem possible. It wasn't just a body torn apart. It was disassembled. The limbs were bent back at unnatural angles, as if something had taken time to methodically separate them. I froze. Then I did the stupid thing. I tried the radio again, nothing, not even static this time. The scene before me defied rational explanation. The blood pattern suggested violence beyond animal predation. It radiated outward from a central point as if exploded from within. The remains were arranged with a terrible precision, bones placed in parallel lines, organs separated by type and laid out like some grotesque taxonomy display. My forensics training, limited as it was to what rangers need for wildlife poaching cases, told me this was recent, hours not days. The blood hadn't fully congealed in the cool forest air. Based on the clothing fragments, this had likely been a male hiker in his 30s, possibly another victim beyond Schreiber. There wasn't going to be a lot of explaining to do. This scene spoke for itself. But that's when I heard it again. The thumping, closer now, and a low, slow breathing sound. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't leave without documentation. With trembling hands, I withdrew my camera, forcing myself to photograph the scene systematically. Evidence first, fear second. They'd drilled that into us during training. Click. Wind. Click. Wind. The mechanical process helped steady my nerves, gave me something to focus on besides the overwhelming horror surrounding me. I don't know why I looked behind me. Maybe I hoped I'd see another ranger, someone human walking toward me. Instead, I saw it. Standing half hidden by trees was something taller than any person had any right to be. Its arms were long, unnaturally so, nearly dragging along the ground. Its face, or what I could make of it, was obscured by a tangled mess of hair or fur. The smell hit me before I even registered the rest of its body. Rot, decay, and something metallic. It was hunched but still towering, and its fingers ended in long, sharp claws, slick with something I didn't want to identify. Time seemed to stretch, elasticized by terror. The creature stood unnaturally still, its only movement the slow rise and fall of breathing. 7 feet tall at minimum, its proportions wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Its skin, what I could see of it beneath the matted hair, was a pallid gray-green with patches of what looked like lichen or fungal growth. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. Not animal eyes, not human either. They reflected no light yet somehow glowed from within, vertical pupils dilating as they fixed on me. Intelligence lurked there, cold and ancient, assessing me with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. I didn't wait. I took off, running in the direction I'd come, my feet pounding the earth harder than I ever thought I could manage. It was fast, though, too fast, and I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me. I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped against my face. My clothes snagged on thorn bushes, but I didn't care. The pursuit was unlike anything I'd experienced. The creature moved with a terrible efficiency, sometimes parallel to my path, sometimes behind, herding me like prey. It didn't vocalize, no roars or growls, just that measured breathing and the rhythmic impact of limbs against the forest floor. I veered sharply back toward the main trail, hoping the more open ground would give me some advantage. The creature seemed to anticipate this, crashing through a thicket to my right to intercept me. I caught a glimpse of it in full motion, limbs extending in ways that defied skeletal constraints, body undulating rather than running. I could feel my lungs burning, every step heavier than the last. If I could just make it to the trailhead, maybe I'd be able to call for help. Real help. Not this piece of junk radio I was carrying around like some kind of sick joke. A fallen tree blocked my path. Without breaking stride, I vaulted over it, landing awkwardly and twisting my ankle. Pain shot up my leg, but adrenaline pushed it aside. 20 yards behind me, the creature cleared the same obstacle, landing with the grace of a predator born to the hunt. The forest began to thin, sunlight penetrating the canopy more frequently. The trailhead couldn't be far now. My muscles screamed in protest, but primitive survival instinct drove me forward. Behind me, the creature's pursuit had taken on an almost playful quality, slowing when it could have closed the gap, speeding up when I found a burst of energy. Then I saw it, my truck, parked where I'd left it hours earlier. The normality of it, this machine of human civilization sitting placidly amid my terror, created a surreal contrast. 20 yards. 10. The creature's breathing was at my neck now, a fetid warmth against my skin. I broke through the tree line and stumbled out onto the gravel road where I'd left my truck. There wasn't a moment to waste. I slammed the door shut, fumbled the keys in the ignition, and peeled out of there like a man who had just seen his death staring back at him. Through the rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of the creature. It stood at the forest edge, making no attempt to pursue further. As I accelerated away, I swear it raised one elongated arm in what almost seemed like a farewell gesture. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror. I took curves too fast, the truck fishtailing on gravel roads. Twice I nearly went into ditches. My hands wouldn't stop shaking and my breathing came in ragged gasps. The radio crackled to life halfway back, Carl's voice asking for a status update, but I couldn't form coherent words to respond. When I reached the ranger station, I burst in and managed to blurt out what I'd seen. My supervisor, Carl, stared at me for a long moment before calmly standing up and grabbing the phone. He made a few calls while I sat there, trying to piece together the mess that was my mind. The coffee he pushed into my hand spilled over the edges as I tried to drink. Words tumbled out of me in a disorganized flood. The backpack, the scattered clothes, the dismembered body, and finally the creature itself. As I spoke, I realized how it sounded. The ravings of a man who'd lost his grip on reality. "Ron," Carl said finally, his voice steady. "We're going to get a team out there right away. But I need you to try and calm down, think clearly. Was there any identification on the remains?" No, I managed. But Schreiber's ID was under the backpack. I think there might be more than one victim. The next few hours passed in a haze. I filled out incident reports, drew crude sketches of what I'd seen, handed over my camera with its undeveloped film. A paramedic checked me over, noting elevated blood pressure and minor lacerations from branches. Someone gave me a sedative that dulled the edges of my terror but did nothing to erase the image of those inhuman eyes. 2 hours later, there were state troopers, search and rescue teams, and more people with serious-looking faces than I'd ever seen in my life. They assembled quickly, efficiency born of practice, loading up vehicles with rescue gear and forensic equipment. I was asked to guide them back to the site, but my ankle had swollen to twice its normal size and Carl insisted I stay behind. Mark knows those trails almost as well as you do, he assured me. They'll find whatever's out there. So I waited, dozing fitfully in the break room as the sedative worked through my system. Dreams came in violent flashes, running, blood, those eyes tracking me through endless trees. Each time I jolted awake, expecting to find myself back in that clearing. The search teams returned after dusk, their expressions a mixture of confusion and frustration. We found the trailhead, followed your exact route based on the map you marked, the state police sergeant told me. But here's the thing. They didn't find anything. Not a trace of blood, no dismembered body, not even the torn clothes I'd seen along the trail. They took my report, but you could see it in their eyes. They thought I'd lost it out there. There's no evidence of any disturbance in the area you described, the sergeant continued, his voice carefully neutral. We combed a half-mile radius from each point you marked. No blood, no body parts, no unusual tracks. That's impossible, I protested, struggling to my feet despite my injured ankle. I took photos. I documented everything. Carl placed a restraining hand on my shoulder. Ron, the film was exposed when they developed it. Every frame was black. A coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the evening chill. My notebook, then. I wrote down everything. The notebook was produced, my handwriting deteriorating into unreadable scrawls after the initial observations. The final pages contained nothing but jagged lines and repetitive circles, a script I had no memory of writing. The state police sergeant cleared his throat. Mr. Whitman, how long have you been working in this region? 8 months, I answered automatically. Any history of hallucinations? Episodes of disorientation? Medication you might have forgotten to take? The implication was clear. They thought I'd fabricated everything, or worse, experienced some kind of psychotic break. I looked to Carl for support, but his expression had shifted to concerned professionalism. Ron's been an exemplary ranger, he said carefully, but the isolation up here can affect people differently. And there was the Schreiber disappearance last week. I'm not making this up. My voice rose sharply, echoing through the station. There's something out there, something hunting in these woods. The sergeant exchanged glances with Carl. We'll maintain the search for Mr. Schreiber, of course. And we'll check the area again tomorrow in better light. For now, I suggest you get some rest, Mr. Whitman. They left me sitting there, the weight of their disbelief pressing down like a physical force. One of the younger rangers, Mark Isley, lingered behind. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I believe something happened out there. Maybe not exactly what you think you saw, but something. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Mark glanced toward the door to ensure we were alone. Last month I was tracking a wounded moose near Pebble Lake. Found it dead, but not eaten. It was arranged just like you described. Limbs positioned, organs separated. I reported it as a possible poaching, but what? The tracks around it weren't human or animal. At least not any animal I've seen in 15 years of hunting these woods. He pressed a small object into my palm. Found this there too. Never showed it to anyone else. It was a claw, 5 inches long, curved like a raptor's talon, but thicker, heavier. The base where it would connect to flesh was jagged, as if it had been broken off rather than shed naturally. The material wasn't keratin or bone, but something that resembled weathered ivory with faint greenish striations. What is this? I whispered, though I already knew. Mark shook his head. Don't know. Lab at the university might be able to tell you. Just be careful who you talk to about this, Ron. Some things people aren't ready to accept. He left me holding the claw, its weight insignificant, yet somehow the heaviest thing I'd ever carried. That night, alone in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the settling structure, every whisper of wind through pine needles set my nerves jangling. I placed a kitchen knife beside my bed and wedged a chair under the doorknob. The claw sat on my nightstand, a physical reminder that I wasn't losing my mind. Dawn brought a semblance of rationality with its pale light. I examined the claw more carefully, noting its unnatural density and the way it seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. This was evidence. Physical, tangible evidence that something unknown was stalking the peninsula. I called in sick, unable to face Carl's concerned scrutiny, or the sidelong glances from colleagues who'd undoubtedly heard about my episode. Instead, I drove to Northern Michigan University in Marquette, where a former college roommate worked in the biology department. Alan Richter had always been unconventional, his brilliant mind constantly seeking mysteries at the fringes of established science. If anyone would approach this objectively, it would be him. Fascinating, he murmured, turning the claw under his laboratory microscope. The cellular structure is unlike anything in our comparative anatomy database. Meaning what exactly? I pressed. Meaning, he said, looking up with excitement rather than fear. This doesn't match any known terrestrial species. The closest analog would be certain deep-sea organisms that evolved in isolation, but even that's a stretch. Could it be a hoax? Something manufactured? Alan shook his head. No. The growth patterns here are organic, not fabricated. This grew on a living creature, Ron. He hesitated. Where exactly did you find this? I gave him an abridged version of events, omitting the more fantastical elements of my encounter. Alan listened intently, his scientific skepticism battling with obvious fascination. I'd need to run more tests, he said finally. DNA sequencing, composition analysis. It would take time, and I'd need to be discreet. This isn't exactly within my department's approved research parameters. How long? A week, maybe 2. He carefully placed the claw in a specimen container. In the meantime, I'd suggest you document everything. If there's an undiscovered species in the peninsula, we need data, habitat, behavior patterns, physical characteristics. You think I should go back out there? The idea sent a chill through me. Alan's expression grew serious. As a scientist, yes. As your friend, stay the hell away from whatever this came from. I left the university with conflicted emotions. Validation that I wasn't crazy, but deepening dread about what actually lurked in those woods. On the drive back to Whitefish Harbor, I made my decision. I quit the next day. I know what I saw, and I wasn't about to go back out there and pretend it was some hallucination or figment of my imagination. I've been a lot of things in my life, but crazy isn't one of them. Carl took my resignation with a mixture of disappointment and relief. Maybe it's for the best, he said, signing the paperwork without argument. This job isn't for everyone. It's not the job I'm leaving, I told him plainly. It's what's in those woods. His expression shifted subtly. Ron, I've been a ranger for 30 years. If there was something out there, then you either haven't seen it yet, or you're not telling me everything. I studied his face, looking for any sign of knowledge hidden behind professional concern. Carl held my gaze for a long moment before looking away. Be careful what you say to people, Ron. Reports like yours, they can follow you. I cleaned out my cabin that afternoon, packing 8 months of life into my old Chevy Impala. As I loaded the last box, Mark approached, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Did you get that thing analyzed? He asked quietly. It's not from any known animal, I confirmed. My friend's running more tests. Mark nodded as if this confirmed something. There's talk among the Ojibwe elders. They won't go near Dead Man's Creek, haven't for generations. They call it Winnebago's boundary. Meaning what? Meaning it's a place where their trickster spirit set a border between worlds. He handed me a folded piece of paper. This was in Schreiber's tent. Search team missed it, but I found it when we were packing up the evidence. It was a page torn from a journal, the handwriting increasingly frantic. Third night. The sounds are circling closer. Not animal. Something watching from the trees. Locals warned me, but I didn't listen. It mimics. God help me, it mimics. If anyone finds this, stay away from... The entry ended mid-sentence. There's more, Mark continued. 2 hikers went missing last year in the same area. Records show 5 disappearances in the past decade, all within 3 miles of that creek. Carl knows. The senior rangers all know. They just don't talk about it. Why not? Tourism funding, take your pick. He shrugged helplessly. Plus, who'd believe it? You saw how the state police reacted. Some things the world isn't ready to acknowledge. I drove south that evening, watching the wilderness recede in my rearview mirror. With each mile, rational thought reasserted itself. Perhaps I had experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Perhaps the claw was from some obscure but mundane species. Perhaps Mark was feeding into my delusion with folklore and coincidences. But in the deepest part of night, alone in a motel room halfway to Chicago, I knew better. Those eyes had seen me, recognized me as something other than itself, and somewhere in Michigan's Upper Peninsula it waited, patient as the ancient forest around it. I spent the next 3 months trying to rebuild my life in Chicago, found a small apartment in Wicker Park, took a job at an outdoor equipment retailer, mundane work that required no confrontation with the inexplicable. I told friends and family I'd left the Ranger Service due to budget cuts, a lie easier to explain than the truth. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by dreams of pursuing footfalls and vertical pupilled eyes. I'd wake gasping, certain something was crouched in the dark corners of my room. Rational daylight couldn't fully dispel these night terrors. They lingered like smoke, tainting everyday moments with irrational fear. Alan called in late October with results from his analysis of the claw. "Ron," his voice crackled through poor cell reception, "you need to come back up here. What I've found, it's not something I should discuss over the phone. Just tell me what it is," I insisted, unwilling to return north. A long pause. "The DNA doesn't match anything in any database, not just our universities, but national and international catalogs. The cellular structure shows evidence of extreme adaptation to environmental pressures that don't exist in North America. And the carbon dating, what about it? The sample dates to approximately 8,000 years ago. That's impossible for organic material this well preserved unless it's been fossilized, which this clearly hasn't been." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "You're saying it's prehistoric?" "I'm saying it shouldn't exist, Ron, not here, not now." His voice dropped lower. "There's something else. The university got an unexpected visit from federal officials yesterday. They were asking about unusual biological specimens recently submitted for analysis." "Did you tell them?" "No, I've kept this off the books. But someone knows something, Ron, and they're looking for evidence." After ending the call, I sat in my apartment staring at nothing, the implications spiraling through my mind. Whatever I had encountered wasn't just an undiscovered species. It was something that should have vanished millennia ago, if it had ever existed in our world at all. I might have continued my self-imposed exile from the Upper Peninsula indefinitely, if not for what happened next. Carl called me about a week after I left, said he didn't blame me for quitting, but that some of the rangers had been hearing strange noises out near Dead Man's Creek again. Said they'd found more things hanging from trees, items that didn't belong to any animals. His voice carried the weight of a man finally confronting something he'd long denied. 3 more hikers missing in the past month. Same area, same pattern. No traces, no bodies. The official story is still animal attacks or disorientation, but you know better, I finished for him. Mark showed me that claw before he disappeared. My blood ran cold. Mark's missing? 4 days ago. Routine patrol near the creek. Radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. Carl's professional demeanor cracked slightly. He was talking about something moving parallel to him through the trees. Something too tall to be a bear. The conversation that followed laid bare the secret knowledge the senior rangers had harbored for decades. Disappearances dating back to the 1930s, all clustered around the same region. Search dogs refusing to track in certain areas. Electronic equipment failing systematically. The Ojibwe warnings that went unheeded. "We've managed to keep it contained in reports," Carl admitted. "Attributed incidents to wildlife exposure accident. But it's escalating, Ron. Whatever's out there is getting bolder, ranging further from its territory. What are you asking me to do?" I already knew the answer, dreaded it. "Come back. Help us hunt this thing." The desperation in his voice was palpable. "You've seen it closer than anyone who's lived to tell about it. You know how it moves, how it thinks. It doesn't think like us. Carl, that's what makes it so dangerous. Exactly why we need you." Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself driving north again 2 days later. The peninsula was in full autumn glory, forests ablaze with color that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. I met Carl and a small team at a research outpost rather than the main ranger station. 5 senior rangers, 2 wildlife biologists, and a representative from the State Department of Natural Resources who clearly hadn't been told the full story. Our official operation is tracking an aggressive predator, likely a rogue bear, Carl informed the group, maintaining the facade. Unofficially, he glanced at me. I laid out everything: the encounter, the evidence, Alan's analysis. The state representative scoffed openly until Carl produced a folder of previously unreleased reports spanning decades. We're not dealing with any known predator, I concluded. We need to approach this understanding that conventional tactics may be useless. The plan that emerged was methodical. Grid searches in teams of 3, never alone, with constant radio contact. Advanced thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the forestry department. Motion-activated cameras positioned throughout the target area. If something was haunting these woods, we would document it, understand it, and if necessary, end it. We established base camp a safe distance from Deadman's Creek, close enough for daily operations but far enough. We hoped to be outside the creature's territory. The first 3 days yielded nothing beyond ordinary wildlife signs and the occasional equipment malfunction. Cameras failing mysteriously, batteries draining without explanation. On the 4th day, the southwestern team reported finding a tree where something had embedded dozens of small animal bones in a spiral pattern up the trunk, too high and too precise for human hands without equipment. That night, 2 rangers reported hearing something circling our camp, its footfalls matching the rhythm I described in my account. Day by day, evidence mounted. A deer carcass arranged with that same methodical precision, deep footprints that appeared and disappeared as if the creature could phase in and out of solid ground. Brief thermal imaging captures of something unnaturally tall moving between trees. There one moment, gone the next. The state representative left on the 6th day, visibly shaken. Document everything, he instructed Carl. But this stays classified until we understand what we're dealing with. The public panic would be unmanageable. On the 8th day, we found Mark's ranger hat hanging from a branch near the creek, perfectly preserved despite the weeks of exposure. Beneath it lay a neat circle of unidentified bones, not human, not animal, arranged with the same terrible precision I'd witnessed before. That night, huddled around maps in the command tent, I voiced the theory that had been forming since my return. It's not hunting randomly, I said, marking the locations of all documented incidents. There's a pattern here, a boundary it's establishing. Every disappearance, every display, they form a perimeter around this central area. I circled a region approximately 2 miles in diameter, centered on a particularly dense section of old-growth forest. What's in there? One of the biologists asked. Carl unfolded a geological survey map. Nothing specific on our charts. Some limestone caves, a natural spring. The Ojibwe called it the sleeping place in their oldest records. I think it's defending territory, I continued. The displays aren't just kills, they're warnings. Markers to establish boundaries. It only attacks when those boundaries are crossed. So we stay out of its territory, our ranger suggested. Mark it off limits, create some natural preserve designation. It's expanding, Carl countered, overlaying maps from different decades. The incident boundary has grown almost a quarter mile in each direction since the 1970s. At that rate, it will eventually reach populated areas. I finished grimly. The decision came reluctantly but unanimously. We needed to enter the central territory, find whatever lair or nest this creature called home, and end the threat permanently. A team of 6 would make the attempt. Carl, myself, 2 senior rangers with military backgrounds, and the biologists who would document everything. Dawn broke cold and clear on the day of our incursion. We armed ourselves as best we could. Hunting rifles, tranquilizer guns, flamethrowers borrowed from the fire management team. Each person carried emergency beacons, radios, and enough supplies to last 3 days if necessary. The forest grew denser as we approached the boundary. The trees older and more gnarled, canopy so thick that perpetual twilight reigned below. Moss grew in unnatural patterns on north-facing trunks, forming symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into trees during my first encounter. 3 hours into our trek, all electronic equipment failed simultaneously. Radios, GPS units, even analog watches stopped. The air grew noticeably colder despite the mid-morning sun above the canopy. Sounds dampened as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We're close, I whispered, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. The clearing appeared suddenly as if the forest had parted like a curtain. Unlike the surrounding woods, this space was perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards in diameter. No trees grew within it, only a carpet of moss interspersed with white mushrooms arranged in concentric rings. At the center stood a monolithic slab of black stone, easily 20 feet tall, its surface covered with petroglyphs of a style I'd never encountered, curved symbols that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. "My God," one of the biologists breathed. "This isn't natural formation. This was constructed." "How old?" Carl asked, approaching the monolith cautiously. "Thousands of years at minimum. Predates any known Native American structures in this region." I felt a familiar prickling at the base of my skull, the sensation of being watched. "We need to leave now." "But we just found it's here," I hissed, raising my rifle and scanning the tree line. They emerged simultaneously from all sides, not one creature but 5, identical to what I'd encountered months earlier. They moved with that same terrible fluidity, too tall, too thin, limbs extending beyond natural proportions. Their faces remained obscured by matted hair, but those eyes, those vertical pupilled eyes, fixed on us with ancient intelligence. What followed will forever haunt my nightmares. The creatures didn't attack immediately, but began a slow, ritual movement around the clearing's perimeter. Each step precisely timed, each gesture mirroring the others as if performing some primordial dance. The air grew thick with that metallic odor, making breathing difficult. Carl fired first, a shot that should have dropped any natural creature. The bullet passed through the nearest entity without effect, as if it were composed of dense fog rather than flesh. The creature didn't react, continuing its measured circuit. The biologists frantically documented everything, cameras flashing, voices shaking as they narrated observations into recorders that likely captured nothing. Then as one, the creatures stopped. Their elongated heads tilted at identical angles, listening to something beyond human perception. The monolith at the clearing's center began to vibrate, a low hum building to a frequency that rattled teeth and blurred vision. "Run," I screamed, grabbing Carl's arm and pulling him toward our entry point. 2 rangers made it out behind us. The biologists weren't so fortunate. Their screams echoed briefly before cutting off with terrible finality. We didn't look back, crashing through underbrush with blind panic. The sounds of pursuit all around us, that rhythmic thumping keeping perfect time despite the chaotic terrain. How we escaped, I still can't fully explain. Perhaps the creatures allowed it. Perhaps they wanted witnesses to carry their warning. We emerged from the deep forest as sunset painted the sky crimson, stumbling into the base camp where the remaining team waited with growing concern. The operation was officially terminated the following day. The explanation given to authorities involved an aggressive bear pack and unfortunate accidents. The families of the biologists received vague reports of research mishaps. The territory around Dead Man's Creek was quietly designated a restricted ecological research zone, closed to public access. I haven't been back to the Upper Peninsula since. As for whatever's out there, it's not my job to figure it out anymore. But I know it remains, patient as the centuries, guarding whatever ancient secret lies beneath that monolith. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind blows from the north, I swear I can hear that rhythmic thumping, matching perfectly the beating of my heart. A reminder that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed, some territories never meant for human understanding. If you find yourself in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, enjoy the breathtaking forests and pristine lakes. Take photographs, fish the clear streams, hike the marked trails. But if locals warn you about certain areas, if rangers suggest alternative routes, heed their advice. Some parts of the wilderness should remain wild, some secrets kept buried in the dark earth of forgotten places. What waits in the deep woods has existed long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Its patience is geological, its purpose unknowable, and it remembers every face it has ever seen.